Blacksmith of the Apocalypse. By Arcuser. Chapter 301. Gear up. Do you even have any idea how to get out of the cell? Puffles asked worriedly. Seth was putting so much effort into readying himself, but if he couldn't leave the cell without being noticed. Oh, that? I have an idea for that. It will be a surprise. After getting a good rest, Seth got up and returned to his work. He wanted to slowly get started with upgrading some of his current equipment. Some still had no enchantment because he didn't see his skills fitting at the time. One of them was his wyvern cuirass. At the time he was unsatisfied with the options he had. The test on the chainmail gave him hope and he wanted to raise the stakes. Of the enchantments he had, Pirithous punishment seemed promising. Seth remembered roughly that this man had tried to woo or kidnap Persephone, Hades' wife, and was bound to a stone when he sat down to rest. It sounded more like a weapon enchantment that would cause a snare effect. He fathomed that it could work with the earth affinity from the bull's hide. On the other hand, it could turn the armor into a cursed object which would stop you from moving once you wore it. This seemed too risky for his taste. Instead, he chose a familiar name, Tisiphone's Revenge. The description talked about Tisiphone enacting retribution for suffered harm. This seemed like a good traditional enchantment for a big piece of armor like the wyvern cuirass. It also fit the reflect curse, which was based on nature retribution for the death of a white bull. Seth would have liked something that acted with the fire glass if the breastplate, but he was afraid that fire of Phlegethon would turn it into a flaming armor like the chainmail, which was way too flashy. The ice effects also didn't seem to distinguish between friends and enemies, either. It wasn't what he wanted. This only left Tisiphone's Revenge as the most promising enchantment. He decided to engrave the sigil on the right chest of the breastplate. Left were the wyvern scales over the heart, and right would be the sigil. Before Seth engraved the enchantment, he decided to use reinforce for its intended purpose. By giving the armor a once-over and fixing smaller deficiencies, he could infuse power into the material to strengthen it. Like this, he could infuse the additional boost it would have had with his current skill level. The sigil resembled a pair of abstract wings, and when Seth finished it, a number of engravings started covering the cuirass. They looked like winding snakes and didn't only cover the breastplate but also the wyvern scales of the skirt. They even appeared on the bull leather, looking like tattoos. Ding! A synergy has increased the power of your item. Wyvern Cuirass. Epic Wyvern Set 1/4. Unique. Physical.def, 1600. Mag.def 925. Durability, 4000. 150% less damage from fire-related attacks. 240% less damage from earth-related attacks. 325% less damage from wind-related attacks. 425% less damage from magic. 5 curse, reflect. 6 passive skill, Tisiphone's Mirror. The tremendous rework of Craftsman Smith. The synergy between several different kinds of materials, divine enchantment, and treatment has turned this cuirass into a frightening defensive item. Once rumors of the armor's effects spread or it plays a role in the user's ascent to a legend, the item will become legendary. All options had been strengthened and a new skill had been added, too. Passive skill, Tisiphone's Mirror, no cost. Punishment is due. 50% of suffered damage will be reflected onto the attacker. 75% chance to cause either disease or illness. A chance to cause torturing madness when special conditions are met. The wording of the fifth option had also changed. It did not seem to have majorly strengthened at first, but he soon realized why the change was important. Passive skill, Curse Reflect, no cost. Harm me and be despised. 50% of the damage suffered is negated and reflected, causing a natural curse. Wounds and status effects cannot be healed through conventional means. Before, the skill said that any attack that hit the armor would be directly reflected and cause a curse. Now it said suffered damage would be negated. This way it didn't overlap with Tisiphone's Mirror and lessen its effect. Had it not changed, 50% of an incoming attack would have been reflected and the divine skill could have only thrown back 25% of the full attack, as he would only suffer 50% of the initial attack. Now he suffered the damage before it was negated. It seemed a little weird and didn't seem to fit the nature of the bull hide, but taking into account that the change happened because of the divine enchantment, it seemed possible. Also, the addition of making status effects harder to recover from. Together these two skills would make attacking Seth a nightmare for any enemy. He hadn't expected it to become this broken, but he definitely would not complain. No, he planned to become even more broken. His next idea was a shot in the blue, but the one he looked forward to the most. He brought out the celestial gambeson. This golden flowing piece of woven metal would be the basis of his next project. For this item, Seth made a hard decision. He would dismantle one of his items. With the helm of Hades, he could not wear the protective crown. As he needed the loyal soul for this item, he decided to dismantle it and take the soul from it. It was a hard decision as auto shield was a great skill to have, but taking into consideration how ambitious the item he was trying to make was, the loyal soul was vital. Seth used several medium souls to repair it and did his best to minutely copy the cloth armor as he forged the healed soul. This item was one of his first thoughts when he found out about the possible synergy with his trait, but he had lacked the confidence to attempt it until now. This had changed when he saw this new enchantment. It was neither counted as Chthonian nor Olympian, however, Seth didn't quite understand why. He knew the god definitely counted as a god of Olympus. The sigil resembled an ornate cane entwined by a snake, and when he engraved it on the left chest of the soul gambeson it was slightly different from those beforehand. There was no great change to the overall soul armament, instead there was a slight color change which made the cloth armor somewhat look like a wavy cloak. Ding! A synergy between material and enchantment has increased the power of your item. He had only finished the soul armament and already got this notification. Looking at the changes, he could easily spot what option was added because of the soul. He was off to a good start, but it was only the first step. Seth infused the soul armament into the celestial gambeson and dunked it into the waters of Styx. Ding! A synergy between material and enchantment has increased the power of your item. Ding! A synergy between material and enchantment has increased the power of your item. Ding! A synergy between item and trait has increased the power of your item. He had hoped for the last synergy, but it was the why was the first one doubled? The material had reacted with the enchantment? In wonder, he looked at the new item. The Golden Fleece, Concept. Unique. Physical.def, 1050. Mag.def 880. Durability, 3300. 1 Strength and defense by 50% for 10's mana cost 50. 2 Weight of the armor is decreased by 75%. 3 plus 50% power to all fire and light based attacks. 4 Item is immune to fire or light damage. 5 plus 250% health regeneration. 6 Passive skill, Auto cast. 7 Magic, Superior heal is available. 8 Magic, Superior purification is available. 9 Magic, Superior cure is available. A rendition of the mythical object from Olympian legends. Created by the experienced hands of tailor craftsman Nadal and craftsman Smith. A high-quality cloth armor made with excellent weaving and sewing techniques imbued with high craftsmanship and divine powers. Once rumors of the armor's effects spread or it plays a role in the user's ascent to a legend, the item will become legendary. Magic, Superior cure, no cost, cooldown 10 minutes. Cure almost all status effects on target. Magic, Superior heal, no cost, cooldown 10 minutes. Heal major injuries and reattach severed limbs on target. Magic, Superior detox. Detox even strong, curse and deadly poisons on target. Seth looked at it with big eyes. It had ended up even better than he had expected. The option of the enchantment had even strengthened after gaining the synergy. The enchantment used was called Asclepius Aid, which added the 3 skills and a 200% increase in health regeneration. This had already been more than he expected, as Seth had only expected the tremendous buff to health regeneration or some more resistance against diseases from its description. Asclepius Aid. A helping hand from a man who even became a god based on his medical knowledge that could even bring the dead back to life. This had given him the confidence that it could turn the golden celestial gambeson into the golden fleece. On top of it came the material's resistance to fire. He remembered that the fleece was originally guarded by a dragon and could only be stolen after being blessed with a fireproof blessing. On top of that, he used the loyal soul which resembled Chrysomalos, the ram the golden fleece originated from. He vaguely remembered that it had willingly been sacrificed. It still didn't completely explain how Asclepius Aid had even further strengthened and the skills had become superior. Until he thought of where the celestial bronze came from. Say, Puffles, about the celestial bronze, does it have some special effects with divine power? Haha, do you finally realize my greatness? Have you forgotten that our thread is the material for the garments of God? Of course, it has a special relationship with divine powers. Seth just nodded silently. Then it made sense. Then he danced a jig in joy. He could now heal himself, cure status effects and get rid of even deadly poisons. He hugged the golden fleece and immediately equipped it and tried to use the skills on himself. It was like the fire magic embedded in his gloves and he felt very good afterward, although he had not been conscious of any disease or wound. Feeling fit, he continued. He was sure he could finish everything today. Chapter 302. Ready, Seth. All the items he was making were not just the improvements needed for him to feel safe once he started his operation. They were all experiments at the same time. The next one would be a rather large step in experimenting. The next involved a very precious item he couldn't really afford to ruin, but he didn't have the time for long tests. It was a masterpiece Nadal had sent him back a few weeks prior. It was an almost translucent grey cloak. The fabric felt thin and smooth in his hand but not flimsy at all. Spectral cloak. Epic. Physical def, 740. Mag def, 450. Durability, 3000. 1. Strengthen defense by 50% for 30s mana, cost 50. 2. The cloak is almost weightless. 3. 25% camouflage when wearing. 4. Plus 20% movement speed. 5. Foresight skills are slightly strengthened. 6. Passive skill, Spectre Amity. 7. Passive skill, Intuition. A high-quality cloak made by the experienced hands of tailor craftsman Nadal. Excellent weaving and sewing techniques imbued this item with overwhelming performance and effects. Just like this, the cloak was already a spectacular item that reminded Seth of something like an invisibility cloak. When wearing it, Seth felt very light, and for others, it looked as if someone reduced his opaqueness by a quarter. The passive skills were also quite interesting. Spectre Amity made most ghosts non-aggressive to his presence. Intuition could help him to find his way when he pulled the hood down into his face. It resembled the feeling he had when he used the system guidance during the crafting of a blueprint. He would have a slight inclination of direction to go if he knew his goal. In a way, it reminded him of a special compass from a movie he had once seen, but he couldn't remember its name. It had something to do with pirates. Originally, he had been struggling with himself whether to use the Wanderer's soul on the cloak or rather use the soul on an item for Evie and see whether there would be a special effect. Seth didn't know whether it was really the souls of her brother or just an appropriation made by the system. If it had some lingering memories, it would have been interesting to see whether it would react to Evie or not. He was sure the soul's effect could have an interesting synergy with the cloak, but he didn't have any freedom on this decision, at the moment. The Wanderer's soul was needed for something else. Instead, Seth chose the last big uncommon soul he had gotten from the Glow people. They had a high affinity for magic and he could test the reaction between special souls and the divine enchantments. Seth started out with turning the soul into a replica of the thin cloak. It was harder than expected to copy the thin and look of smoothness of the fabric. The sigil resembling two crossed torches, and he engraved it on the cloak's back as if it was a superhero cape. Afterward, he had doubts that maybe Nico Booz had a bad influence on his taste. As he was working, he could feel a presence again. It was one, but it also felt like three. This was the goddess of magic, necromancy, and pathways, as he was currently working on the blessing of Hecate. The gaze he felt was serious, maybe strict, but he could also feel some goodwill in it. His back had slightly heated up as if a fire was burning behind him when he finished the last stroke of the sigil, and it vanished as if it was absorbed into the soul. This was a first, but the presence was gone and there was no notification of failure. Seth hesitated when he saw the option of the soul cloak, but he couldn't wear it as a soul armament and had no choice but to infuse it into the spectre cloak. He could hear multiple synergy notifications when he dunked the cloak into the barrel. His eyes went wide, especially at the last option. Cloak of Hecate. Unique. Physical def, 1050. Mag def, 1150. Durability, 3000. 1. Strengthen defense by 50% for 30s mana, cost 50. 2. The cloak is almost weightless. 3. 25% camouflage when wearing. 4. Plus 20% movement speed. 5. Foresight skills are slightly strengthened. 6. Passive skill, Undead Amity. 7. Passive skill, Intuition Plus. 8. Passive skill, Quick Cast. 9. Passive skill, Double Cast, Fire. 10. Plus 150% power to all magic. 11. Plus 100% mana regeneration. 12. Damage of fire attacks is doubled. A high-quality cloak made by the experienced hands of tailor craftsman Nadal. Excellent weaving and sewing techniques imbued this item with overwhelming performance and effects. Enchantments by craftsman Smith with the help of a divine being have further improved the item beyond expectations. The last option was not restricted to magic, it would also double the power of the fire he used with pyromancy. Furthermore, besides the obvious additions of effects that strengthened magic, there were changes to the original functions. The chant reduction of the soul had turned into quick cast, which allowed the user to omit the chant when they had a high affinity or a high familiarity with the magic. This meant Seth could quick cast the magic from his gloves but not the ones from the Golden Fleece unless he got familiar with it. On that note, double cast, fire, allowed Seth to copy a fire spell he cast for free. If he cast a fireball in his right hand, he could create one in his left hand simultaneously for free. Spectre Amity was broadened to encompass all undead, and Intuition Plus could now even hint at not just the visible paths but even hidden passageways. Seth had not expected the boost to his firepower, as he only remembered Hecate as the goddess of magic, necromancy, and passageways. When he got back, he would need to polish up his mythology knowledge to help him understand some of these enchantments. It had gone well this time, but it didn't mean it couldn't go bad. Like the experiment with the chain mail. What if he suddenly got an item with negative effects for the wearer because he misunderstood the enchantment? He booked this as a lesson, not an achievement. These Olympian and Chthonian gods had many different authorities, and he couldn't always expect to strike the one he wished for. Before this, Seth had wanted to make a ring using the fortune glass and the blessing of Hades, which he guessed had also an impact on fortune. But now he wasn't too sure anymore. After all, Hades was the master over everything under the earth. His blessing had given him mining skills and earth affinity. But being a god of fortune was just one of his aspects. He was the master of the underworld, the custodian and guardian of the dead. It was much more likely for his blessing to involve something like necromancy. It may even aid his class skills. He didn't have material for that with him and was forced to put that plan on ice. All what was left was his way out of this cell. Chapter 303. Go. Let's make our instrument of freedom. You are going to make an instrument? How would that help? Puffles asked, confused. It's a metaphor, Fudge Roll Al commented. Seth ignored their bickering. His idea was inspired by quite a few games he had played in the past which held an item called a skeleton key. An item that could open any lock or tremendously increased the probability of lock picking. The material he wanted to use might seem surprising, but it was volatile zinc. The uncommon material with constantly changing properties. Seth had looked into the material together with Allison. Well, he left it to Allison and got her results. It was unfit for weapons or armor as it was much too soft and pliable. But, and this was a big but, it was a very suitable item for magic engineering. The properties were naturally random but could be manipulated by the flow of magic or energy. The metal could change its shape in a way that reminded Seth of the videos of magnetic fluids. They were called ferrofluids or something like that. This was the key point in this build. Seth had the idea and now planned it together with Al Salzar. Using the Wanderer's Souls, which had a property akin to finding one's way, and the Ballad of Unlife already had a good chance of working. On top of that, he had a trump card. The Blessing of Hermes, the Divine Messenger. Besides being the patron of travelers or traders, he was also the patron of thieves and was well known for his pranks and schemes. Seth fathomed this was among the Olympian enchantments because he was also the god who would guide the souls of the dead to Hades. It had been either Hecate or Hermes that fit the purpose of a universal master key, but this was less of a key and more of an ever-changing lockpick. The god of thieves seemed to fit this bill better, and he wanted Hecate's magic buffs. The lockpick itself was not hard to make, as Seth made the base of a key which ended in a lockpick. Next was forging the Wanderer's Soul into a copy of the item. Everything went well until he started to engrave the sigil that looked like a winged lyre. He immediately felt the presence behind him, but unlike before where the others just watched, he suddenly felt a hand on his shoulder. When Seth turned his head, he found himself eye to eye with a beautiful youth. Clear blue eyes and golden locks. Their noses almost touched. He wore a small hat with a big feather. That's the wrong soul for this. Hey! The wrong soul, the youth said slowly and grinned mischievously. Here, look. Look. This is the soul you wanted to use. I'm very sure. He rummaged in the small leather pouch on his hip and shoved his arm in it up to the elbow, even though it should have been way too small for that. Deliberately he pulled a soul from the pouch and put it on the table. Here, see. I knew you just misplaced it and accidentally used the wrong one. He winked at Seth and pretended as if he didn't just pull out an unknown soul. Seth had a hard time following what was happening. This was Hermes, right? The god Hermes was standing before him wearing a white tunic and his winged sandals, and he was giving him a soul. Is this really? A serious gaze from Hermes made him stop. He decided to play along. Ah, yes. Sure. Thank you, how could something like this happen? I must be really tired. He took the soul and looked at it. Soul of Polypemon, ego. The soul of the demigod criminal Polypemon. A sinister smith who made his guests fit his iron beds by either stretching them when they were too small or cutting off their legs if they were too tall. Seth stared at Hermes, who kept standing beside him with a big, sweet smile, waiting for him to continue his work. Slightly disturbed, he got to work. He had no idea what was going on, but he didn't want to get on the bad side of a trickster god. He forged the criminal's soul into the shape of the lockpick. Although it was called an ego soul, it didn't keep pestering him as the lich did. Maybe the guy didn't know telepathy before his death? As he started engraving, he kept an eye on Hermes. The youth was sitting on one of the work tables, swinging his leg and watching Seth work. He engraved the winged lyra on the round key head, and when he finished it, a wave of power flowed through the lockpick. Unlike the other gods who would usually leave after the blessing was finished, Hermes stayed. Seeing the blacksmith's questioning look, the god smiled impishly. Does my presence bother you? Ah. No. No. Seth answered, sweating profusely. He infused the soul key into the item and dunked it into the waters of Styx. He only heard a chuckle in the back. When he turned around, Hermes had vanished. Key of Hecate. Unique, ego item. Durability 500. 1 skeleton key. 2 Grand Passage. An artifact that can turn anyone into a legendary thief who fulfills the key's requirements. Created by craftsman Smith with the help of a divine being. Usage conditions: Polypemon's consent, thief class, 300 dexterity. Hecate? But didn't he use the blessing of Hermes? Seth was slightly confused, but maybe it was because of a synergy with his trait or something. This was his best explanation. The effects were everything he wanted. Skeleton key could unlock any key lock. Grand Passage could open even doors without a lock. Who needs magic words like open sesame? He could just tap the master lockpick at the stone and make it open. The abilities were everything he wanted, the conditions were not. He didn't have a thief class. His plan seemed to crumble despite having created such an outstanding item. Let me talk to it, it's an ego item after all, right? Al came as a savior to bring the plan back on track. As she said, it was possible to negotiate with an item, if it had an ego. Seth didn't know telepathy, so he had to rely on Al or Puffles for this. It took a while of tense waiting before Al spoke to him again. Seth had no idea what these two items had talked about, except that the key seemed to have shuddered once or twice while he was holding it. The negotiations are finished. The old coot can allow you to use the skeleton key once a day for 5,000 mana. I tried everything to haggle him down or increase the number of uses, but he's a real robber and I couldn't push him any further. It really seems to be the limit of his influence. Although he got some mixed signals from what Al had said, was he hard to bargain with, or was this the limit of what he could do? Seth accepted this outcome. He just needed to get out of the cell without causing a big commotion. Since he had the helm of Hades, nobody would be able to detect him afterward. Everything was ready for his escape. At this point, Seth was glad he was a blacksmith. Otherwise, they would not have underestimated him as just a crafting class. There were still 2 days before they would come looking for their weapons and find him missing. These were 2 days he could use to roam the place freely without anyone so much as looking for him. He could be a ghost in their halls. Listen in on their conversations and hopefully find a way to save everyone? He didn't even know what he could do yet. Seth simply hoped to be like a specific halfling snooping around in an elven kingdom, and he would find a way to end this situation. Chapter 304. Somewhere else, 6. She ran along with her friends, casting aura of affection. Using the color of their aura, they made insects like butterflies, dragonflies, and fireflies fly around and follow them. It was the third Sarah's, one of the 7 Sarahs. A number of games to learn nature magic. All the children wanted to master these 7 games because they could become an apprentice of Master Karina. Pip was 13 this year. Like many of the others here, she came from a place called Hope. Nobody liked to talk about their past, as it was filled with sad and bittersweet memories. She had only arrived recently and still had a hard time learning the magic. Running around and playing the Severn Sarahs with the other was fun, nonetheless. It had been a long time since she could relax like this. Despite her efforts to distract herself with the wonders of Karina's Grove, as the other children called it, the memories of the past year kept creeping back into her consciousness now and then. Her life was actually quite a happy one and hope lived up its name. Her parents had told her that their ancestors had stood before the choice to either leave their homes or stay and build something new. She still remembered the beauty of the city. The high building that reached far into the sky and the hanging gardens in between them. Her parent owned a big house with many rooms, and they grew vegetables on the roof. She had always loved to help her mother in the garden or visit the market with her father to sell some of their produce. She didn't like school, but it was still fun to meet her friends there. In her memory, those days were sunny and full of smiles. But now they had a bittersweet note, because she knew that those times would never return. Shortly after she turned 12, the grown-ups suddenly started to talk about something they called the apocalypse, and people started using magic and swords. At first, she was stoked about this. She had read a lot of novels about wise magicians and valiant knights. A world filled with swords and sorcery seemed like a dream come true. She was a little bummed that her parents had chosen farmer as their classes because they thought it would help in their work. Aside from the classes, nothing changed, and everything was great. Until she and everyone else realized what an apocalypse was. In the surrounding plains and forests, terrifying and strong beasts started appearing. Wildlife mutated and strange species appeared. People left the city less and less to avoid the danger, but the danger didn't stay outside. People started dying and conventional weapons were useless. People with powerful classes stepped up to protect the community, and she imagined them in glorious fights like in the comics she read. Her fantasy broke apart when monsters appeared in her school. She survived, but the picture of her friends and the people, who were supposed to protect them, dying never left her. In her mind, hope became a darker place afterward. Although they managed to survive and the grown-ups managed to build a wall to protect everyone, something felt broken. Her parents were worried and stressed, like everyone else. They didn't smile as often, and arguments became more frequent. School life was gloomy as many mourned lost friends and family. It was hard to return to the sunny days. Hope withstood the monsters of the apocalypse. But it could not withstand the dreadnought of destruction, people. More and more strangers appeared from the no man's land, and the least of them had good intentions. The once happy atmosphere of hope became a mere facade of people trying to avoid reality as their city fell into the hands of others. Bandits, criminals, and refugees that fled from the districts or the surrounding settlements slowly but surely flocked to Hope. Under the pressure of more and more people, the community crumbled. Outsiders fought for control, and many died. Many had let their life during the initial protection of the city, so now there was no one that could stand up to these invaders. Instead, many decided to turn a blind eye and pretend as if nothing had changed. Still, she and her parents hung in there, but then came her personal apocalypse. They were just doing their work in the botanic gardens when some bandits decided to raid the place and killed Pip's parents before her eyes. The euphoria and glee in their eyes as they slaughtered them before her eyes far outranged the trauma from seeing her friends killed by animals. Animals felt no joy when killing prey. She was disgusted by humanity. She was disgusted by the monsters, but she was even more disgusted by those smiling adults who pretended as if everything was okay. They were slaves in their own homes. Pip had decided to flee. She couldn't stand this city any longer. But it wasn't as easy as one may think. The things she had to do. The things she had to sell. It took a lot to find a way out of these tall and dark walls that were once supposed to keep them safe. No matter how terrible these memories were, it was worth it in the end. Back then she thought that even death in the wilderness and being eaten by monsters was a better fate than staying in that city. Now she knew that the thought was stupid, and life was precious. Pip had faced near death in the deep and dark forests outside. She had felt how it was when the blood wouldn't stop flowing, and she had felt her life trickling away. Everything would have been over if Karina had not found her. Many children here had a similar story to tell. But as mentioned, they rather enjoyed the present than dwell on the past. They ran through meadows and groves and collected insects. Their destination was the stele of the Thirtsaras. A big menhir with a hole inside. They had to cast mind in the moment to see the surrounding mana flow. Inside the hole was a big mana sphere, and they needed to use their aura to make the insects dance within the orb. When a child managed to complete the dance, the menhir would light up and it could inscribe its name on the stone. Putting your name on the menhir was proof to have succeeded in the game. After succeeding in every game, Karina would personally teach magic to them. She always told them that it was best to learn magic from a young age. And once they were old enough, they could choose a powerful job from the system. Karina always gave them hope that they would be able to choose their own way once they were strong enough, but nobody really planned on leaving her. Although she was not human, she was a bright light of hope to these children who were disappointed by the world. A new hope, so to speak. Karina observed the children playing below her crown with a genuine smile on her face. Few adults had the will or the necessary personality to stay with her in this place. As a dryad, she was very perceptive to the aura of beings and couldn't tolerate most adult humans. On the other hand, she liked children even more. Their innocent smiles and laughs. Their pure aura was a blessing to her just as much as this place was a happy place to them. Although she prepared them for the time when they became adults, she dreaded the time when they would leave to become tainted by the world out there. But until then she would protect them. Nobody would be able to harm her foster children as long as they stayed in her grove. Chapter 305. Seth on the prowl. His big sigh echoed through the desolate hallway. How could he have known that she was the plaything of his superior? Still, he just had some fun with a slave. Why did they have to condemn him to guard duty in this place? This was the worst. Standing all day at the entrance to the prison block and feeling bored beyond belief. This wasn't why he joined the army. He wanted to see exotic places and get his hands on exotic slaves. Cute girls, mature women, he was into everything, and he wanted to taste a lot of different races. Now he was stuck down here in this cold, desolate place. Far away from the lovely, mindless little slaves. The only people down here were the prisoners. Even if he could bring them out for some fun, they were all men. And they were of some importance, so even if he found interest in a good-looking one, he would get an even worse job if he was found out. He sat there, blankly staring into the darkness beyond the shine of his candle, and remembered his time with that maid. The punishment was somewhat worth it. He understood why even an officer had taken interest in her. As he stared in the void, a smooth melody started accompanying his fantasies. The sound was sticky and accompanied his fantasy in an almost lewd manner. He fell deeper into his imagination as a light fog started filling his mind. His fantasies slowly sunk into the fog and were replaced by a deep satisfaction. He felt nothing wrong and lent himself to the illusion. And the hummed melody slightly changed and the mist in his mind formed words in his ears. Trust in me. Just in me. His eyelids became heavier and started fluttering. He knew he had to keep them open. It was still his duty to guard the place. But it was just a quiet, tiny voice in the back of his mind. There was no way resisting the enchanting melody from beyond the mist. Shut your eyes, trust in me. His eyes fell shut and he completely fell for the music in his mind. Even if he wanted to resist, it kept pulling him deeper like a quagmire. You can sleep, safe and sound. He felt so tired and sheltered as if he was in a soft bed under a thick blanket. Why would he even fight this urge to sleep? He was so tired and it was so comfortable. Knowing I am around. The guard's mind was gone. Far off into the land of dreams, there was no way he could notice one of the doors slowly swinging open. Don't ever sing that while I am summoned. Al commented after Seth stopped the song. This great me seconds this notion. I feel sticky just hearing it from in here. PFF, that is only because you were not exposed to its effects. Believe me when I tell you that you would be off into dreamland like everyone else down here if it wasn't like that. Until later, Puffles. Wearing the helm of Hades, Seth stepped out of the cell and felt all his system skills being suppressed. They had not found a way to counter this effect despite Al taking her time to study the cell. This meant he had to sing from inside the cell because even his bard skills were now suppressed. All except Orpheus' voice and voice of Seth. Seth could only use his class skills and those given by his items and divine blessings now. As for what he had to do now, he had thought about this a lot in the last 2 weeks. At first, he thought the two biggest hurdles were the suppression of system skills and the space lock. Even if he released people's collars, they wouldn't be able to fight and they wouldn't be able to use home call. It was then that he realized that a lot of the people here were unable to use home call anyway. This left getting rid of the suppression, but at the same time, he had to think of the fact that the people of the theocracy would immediately notice when the suppression was gone. They had been rather neglectful with the people because they had this two-way security. It would become a lot harder to free the captives if everyone became more vigilant. And while he had to try and release them of their collars, the priest could just repair the suppression field. Thinking through many possibilities, Seth came to one conclusion. His biggest problems were the priests and possible reinforcements through the pathworks. He needed to find a way to deal with them, destroy the suppression field and then free the warriors and mages to free the workers and fight possible reinforcements. With these goals in mind, he started wandering through the winding hallways of the enemy's stronghold. The prisoner block he came from was hewn into massive stone and he had to find his way along several stairs to reach the parts built from bricks. He stepped out from a door and found himself in a normal-looking hallway you expect in a medieval castle. Every place he passed until there were rooms for workers, prisoners, or maids that seemingly worked in this place. The rooms below were cold and damp while up here the air was warm and dry. A maid hurried past him with a big basket of laundry. Only her quick steps and the sweat on her face gave away that she was in a hurry. Her face was expressionless like that of a statue. After a moment a worker also passed him from the other direction. This place was probably one of the passages for the servants. As he had just came from where they would have their rooms, it seemed to make sense. Also, the lack of guards. Seth kept exploring the massive structure. Checking door, choosing directions. He kept going around and committing the rough layout to his memory until he was too tired and took residence in one of the many storage rooms. It had been a long time since he last took a break and even longer since he had slept. He had pushed the limits and need to sleep now. It was still bright outside. If he slept now, he could wake up in the night and explore the stronghold further. Although he had not found what he was looking for yet, he was quite satisfied with his progress for now. He had fully explored the place he called the servant area in his mind. It encompassed the storage area, the kitchen, the laundry, the servant quarters, and the passages that led to the private and public sections. He wanted to explore these in the night after a good rest. Those places were well guarded, and Seth didn't want to be found out because some idle guard saw a door spookily open and close from the other end of the hallway. With thoughts of what to do next, he finally fell asleep in the corner of the storage room. Chapter 306. The Dungeon. Hermes had just entered the Pathworks and was on his way back to Olymp. He had come personally instead of just sending a projection. He wandered along the dark passages when he felt a presence behind him. Ah! Hecate, I didn't expect you to arrive this fast. I'm sorry I gave that lockpick your name, but it's just a arg. Ugh. A hand with a vice-like grip had snatched him from behind and slowly lifted him off the ground. The blond youth craned his neck and found himself face to face with an empty hood. The arm that held him led to a figure wearing a gaudy magician's cloak. At first glance, it looked like childish stars and moons were drawn on the dark blue fabric. But the longer he looked the more details he saw. A murky dark aura was enveloping the other and the childish signs kept turning into complicated diagrams and formulas even he, a god, could not understand. Nobody messes with my system. A dark sphere of void shreds enveloped them and they stood in a dark world. There was no light, no sound. Neither energy nor space could be felt here. Hermes's divine senses had been shut down. Where? This is the place I prepared for tricksters like you. Don't worry, you won't be lonely. The hand had suddenly released him and he started falling into the void. He fell and fell and fell. He could not use his powers to fly or flee. He could only wait to smash into the ground if there even was one. Just when he came to the conclusion that he would keep falling, his beautiful face smashed nose first into a smooth hard surface. Blood was trickling from his nose. Yo, did you mess with the rules? An impish voice asked with undisguised schadenfreude. He looked around and saw a mean-looking man with a short black beard sitting in not far from him. He was the only light and sound around. Seth? You too? Yab. Theocracy. Night had fallen and Al-Salzar woke up the sleeping blacksmith. It was time to leave the servant area and take a look at the rest of the fortress. She had fathomed that there had to be a primary nucleus like an altar that channeled divine power into a network to suppress the system. As long as they found and destroyed this center, the suppression field should theoretically be lifted until it is repaired. But she was unsure where this could be located. Finding this was the main priority. Since it could be anywhere, Seth wanted to check the ground floor first and work his way up. The stronghold's hallways were plunged in complete darkness when Seth found his way out of the servant area. These halls were richly decorated with expensive fabrics and paintings. Only areas with guards were illuminated by candle holders. The first floor was made up mostly of offices, dance halls, and things like this. Seth guessed that people were still doing things until deep in the night in the guarded rooms. In a building split off from the main castle, he found the warriors and magicians' quarters. He found them sleeping in big rooms full of small beds. They had it slightly better than the workers. Seth also found a church-like structure with high ceilings, even more, lavish decorations and an altar. A giant statue of a humanoid figure bandaged in chains dominates the hall with an overbearing presence, but it wasn't the nucleus they were looking for. Seth was getting tired from seeing the empty luxurious rooms. It was frustrating that even the offices held no valuable information. All the documents he found were written in an alien language he couldn't understand without the system skills. He wandered through the halls until he finally found a staircase. What made him hesitate was that it led both ways. A flight of stairs led up but another led down again. What confused him was that they were far away from the subterranean rooms he had explored earlier. Where did these lead to? If he was a crazy theocracy that wanted to enslave the rest of the world like a bunch of raving lunatics, where would he put his important nucleus of his power field? The cellar, of course. Seth snuck down the stairs and soon found that this place was not as silent as he had hoped. Once again he entered a network of tunnels, but the air was filled with the smell of blood and the incoherent screams, crying, and gurgling of people. Rows and rows of cells lined the hallways. It was similar to the place he had been, but its purpose was obviously different. He ignored the guards who were playing cards at the entrance chamber and walked down the row of cells. His stomach churned when he looked into the cells. Seth couldn't be called squeamish after all he had seen during the last year, but this made him feel sick. Inside he saw all kinds of people from different races but no humans. They were mutilated in a myriad of ways, and in some of the cells, their tormentors were still at work abusing and torturing their captives. Their sadistic chuckles being mixed with their victims' helpless screams and whimpers. Seth would have run in to stop it, but he could only hold back. If he revealed his presence now, without a good plan, he would simply fail. Still, he kept walking and looking because he wanted to know why this even happened. He couldn't find any humans among the captives, but many looked similar to each other. Seth finally concluded that maybe the collars didn't completely work on some races. It was doubtful that this would lead to the super-secret nucleus of the suppression field. Just when he wanted to turn around and leave, he heard an ear-shattering roar. One he knew. Following the sound in the direction where it came from, he soon found the cell it originated from. Inside, a humongous tiger beastman was strapped to an iron rack. Much of his majestic fur was charred and his body was covered in burns, cuts, and bruises. Toho had been captured and it looked like he was tortured for the last 2 weeks. His impressive muscles had shrunk, but despite the marks of torture, his eyes burned with rage as he roared at the torturer, swinging his whip at the defenseless beastman. His will never broke. Seth had to hurry. Even if his will didn't break, his body would at some point. With grit teeth and clenched fists, he turned away from the torture dungeon and returned to the stairs to go deeper into the belly of the beast. Further down, everything was dark and the tunnels were silent. There was nothing except the biting stench of bleach. He found laboratories that befit a crazy scientist. Rooms for autopsies or operations filled with all kinds of foreign arcane devices and formations. Al, do you have any idea what this is for? Al. I'm not too sure, but I'm afraid they create living dead. Like undead? And no. More like flesh puppets or meat golems. They are still alive, but mindless and grotesquely enhanced. There were also storerooms with rows and rows of shelves. They were filled with jars holding organs, humanoid and beast body parts, and what looked like sheets of skin swimming in something the Lich called a nutrient fluid. These body parts were kept fresh for operations. And soon Seth also got to see what the sorceress had meant with meat golems. Further down he found more cells, or should he call them storage rooms. Looking through the windows in the cell doors, he saw rows of mindless monsters with empty eyes. Many had a humanoid base with many different monster parts added to them, others were genuine chimeras. Beasts mixed with other beasts, their eyes just as empty as those of everything else. They all wore the slave collars. He kept exploring the underground, but he only found more and more rooms with chimeras. There had to be hundreds or even thousands of them. This is an army. Another point was added to his bucket list of worries. Chapter 307. Sand in the gears. He had been wrong. There was no nucleus in the dungeon. The whole underground was filled with an army of chimeras and nothing else. Had they really put the nucleus on the upper floors? Seth spent some more time in the dungeons looking for another staircase or door, but found nothing. He started ascending the stairs again. If it wasn't below, it had to be above. When he arrived back on the ground floor, he noticed that the sky outside was already brightening again. Just how long had he been in the tunnels? One obvious difference to below was the number of doors. There were a lot more, almost like the cells in the dungeon. Seth tried opening them, but few had forgotten to lock their rooms. Each door he managed to open led to a small room. Most were empty, with their inhabitant probably still working somewhere. 1 or 2 had a priest sleeping inside. These were probably the rooms for those of the lowest standing in the church or this stronghold. It was clear they would be treated better than the slaves, but Seth would not have guessed that even the lowest free people got individual rooms. The next floor had significantly fewer rooms with all doors securely locked. Judging by the floor below, these were likely the rooms for the higher-ranked priests. The higher he got, the fewer doors here were, which probably meant the rooms were bigger. He had gone up 4 floors by the time the outside got bright, and at the same time, he realized an unfortunate change. The helm of Hades had stopped working. He could see his own body again, except for the 25% transparency from the cloak of Hecate. He turned around and started sprinting at full speed back and down the stairs. The best thing he could think of, that the helm was not perfect and had something like a 2-4 time limit. But that wasn't important for now. The only place he could think of where he could hide was the dungeons. There was no light and most of the space housed brain-dead abominations. It would be hard spotting him there with his transparency. 1 floor down, 2 floors down. He had just entered the floor of low-ranking priests when he heard a surprised gasp from the hallways. One of the doors stood ajar and a robed figure had just stepped out of the room. He had been seen. In a knee-jerk reaction, Seth charged the priest. He smashed his fist into his stomach and shoved the now lifeless body back into the room. This had to have been an early bird, as all other doors showed no signs of life. It didn't seem like anyone had noticed what just happened. Seth slowly closed the door before directing his attention to the priest on the ground. He started groping around the robes to find the key for the door. His hand stopped when they came across a very familiar feature. He grasped it firmly. Once, twice, then, he was sure. This was a nun. Gamma. Stein was approaching her from behind. The princess was hunched over the map of the area in their temporary command central. It was already late, and the room was only illuminated by the magic lantern on the table. "You should really take a rest, my lady," he said, and put a cup of tea for her on the table. "It's already late. You should go to sleep soon." The princess heaved a heavy sigh and looked at the officer. He was a knight from lower nobility who had served his way up in ranks over many years. Lena knew him since she was a young girl. "You are right, Sir Stein. I will finish soon." With rapt attention he watched her lift the cup to her plump lips. He was barely able to contain his sardonic smile when she took a sip and he saw her swallow it. It took only a moment and her lids felt heavy. She could barely keep her eyes open as strength slowly waned from her arms and legs and she could only sink back onto the chair. Kukiku. How long I had waited for this. She was at his mercy, and he could finally release all of these pent-up desires. It was all thanks to the great Zarkan. He had been too blinded by the weakness perpetuated by the system church. Why should he hold back? It was only natural to take whatever he wanted. Or whoever he wanted. He would help everyone to see this truth. He would show the light and he would start with her. He wanted to prop her on the table while unfastening his pants. Right now, and here he wanted to take her on top of all those plans he was about to ruin. When he reached for her shoulder, his hand suddenly stopped. "I would have never guessed it was him, but you were right, my lady." Samuel stepped out of the shadows. Beside him were the princess and 2 other men. Stein looked at the figure sitting on the chair and found an desiccated undead with its hand sunken on the table. Shocked, he tried to turn and run, but he was frozen in place. Wah, he could only stare. "Although, I wish I was wrong." The princess shook her head. She wanted to approach but threw a questioning glance at the priest. "No worries, I caught him in my snare. He can't move." "You are probably confused about what happened, Sir Stein. For the formidable illusion, you can thank Mr. Baker here, from Y City." The princess gestured at one of the men beside her. It had taken quite some time and effort to negotiate an alliance with Y City and keep it secret. She had suspected that her troops had been infiltrated somehow for a while and used the last few weeks to cement her suspicions. "When did you get infected, Sir Stein?" "Infected? What do you mean infected?" "I have realized the truth. The flesh and its instincts are above everything." Samuel grunted when Stein suddenly started mutation. He grew taller, his clothes ripped, and skin broke apart, turning into thick grey armor plates, and his body bloated into something barely fit to be called human anymore. "TCH, he's actually an enlightened one." Mark lamented and got ready to fight. "I can't hold this thing for much longer," Samuel warned. Lena unsheathed her sword and started chanting. An audible shattering signaled the abomination breaking free from the head priest's binding spell. The floorboard gave in under the thing's weight as it made a step forward. It didn't make a second step as the undead from the table was suddenly strangling it with a rope from behind. Choking the beast and bending its head back, the undead stopped its movement. Moments later, soldiers rushed in and surrounded the beast, catching it with nooses and magic chains. These were the Empire's reinforcements, as the princess had no idea how many of her soldiers had been corrupted. She had used the plan with the starter village as a distraction while she waited for the reinforcements from Epsilon. With the increased forces, they could quarantine the soldiers and weed out those infected. Along with the Empire came some of their temporary allies from Y City with their representative Mark Baker. They had come up with a technology that could recognize the disease of Zarkan and offered an exchange of knowledge. Although the Empire had previously had some bad experiences with the leadership of Y City, it was Baker's effort that led to the shaky alliance of the present. The Zarkists were everybody's problem and Y City wanted them gone, just like Delta. With these new troops and allies, Lena was sure to finish the preparations for the Starta village and drive on the fight against the followers of Zarkan. Chapter 308. Making a plan. So, what are we doing now? The situation had escalated in a weird direction. Seth was sitting in a small room. The furnishings were Spartan, with only a cupboard, a desk, a chair, and a slim bed. On the said bed laid an unconscious nun. The well-endowed priestess was tied up with her own blankets. Seth simply sat there on the chair and intently stared into the void, thinking about what to do now. There wasn't a lot of time. The nun probably had duties. People would notice her disappearance. A bold idea formed in his mind. If he can't kill her and can't keep her here, there was only one thing he could do. Romance her. Now he thought like a bard. Are you serious? Although this great me does not want to agree with the undead nymphomaniac, are you serious? What other option is there? Do you really think you can charm a nun? One of this kind of religion? Don't forget, I have a trickster god's skill. Corruption and charm are part of the description of voice of Seth. On top of that, I have the charm magic from my belt. And if all this is not enough, I have a trump card. I can still power up Persephone's necklace. I saved a good number of souls for such a case. Come on, this should be enough to charm one nun. Let's start. While she was still asleep, he started casting charm on her over and over again. Her sleep became a little unsettled. Her face and her breathing quickened. He didn't really know what to whisper to her with his divine voice, so he let Al advise him. Are you sure I should pretend to be her god? I have no idea what these people believe in. Don't worry, your skills will sell it. She will make the rest up on her own. Well, okay then. My child, I have come before you. I have chosen you for your undeterred belief. Her sleep became more agitated. Wake up in the glory of your... Cut the crap already. There is no way that asshole would visit someone like me. Her arms flung up, lock around his neck. Her knee pushed in his stomach, and she tossed him over herself. Immediately they had switched positions and she was straddling him. Seth had been too surprised by the fact that she had managed to free herself to react to the sudden attack. Before he could catch another thought, a pair of soft lips pressed against his and a small tongue forced his way into his mouth. What the heck is going on? She voiced everyone's thoughts in this situation. What did you terribly handsome bastard do to me? Why can't I stop thinking of kissing your manly? What did you do? Her hand laid around his neck and she kept shaking him in frustration. Seth didn't resist as he was taking literally zero damage. What a weird priestess. Is this normal? Puffles asked, confused. No, this is indeed a weird one. The caterpillar and the lich, as unconcerned parties, held a calm conversation about the peculiarities of the clergy. The blacksmith could only listen as a pair of soft hands tried to harm him while she let off some steam. When she finally calmed down a little, she took as much distance as possible and pressed into the opposite corner of the room beside the door. I don't even know you. I will not give in to these desires. Child, you need to calm down. And Seth started again with voice of Seth but was interrupted. I told you to stop with that act. There is no way a trash god like that would visit some low-rank nun and non-believer like me. You are an intruder. I will report you. She wanted to rush out of the door, but it was locked. The next moment hand slammed in the door beside her head. She turned around and looked up into the tall intruder's eyes. He had a smug smile on his face. Again, an alien attraction grew in the back of her mind as she looked up at his face. A non-believer, you say? Seth spoke in a smooth voice thickly laced with magic. He had caught onto her slip of the tongue and hooked onto it. He could see the gaze in her eyes change again. She had a very strong will, but he also had used charm a lot while she was unconscious. This makes things a lot easier. I believe we set off on the wrong foot. Don't worry, the magic will wear off with time. I didn't mean to do any harm. How about a calm conversation? His voice entered her ears like honey for the soul. She calmed down tremendously from hearing that these contradicting feelings were not permanent, but at the same time her favor for this stranger grew. She wanted to trust him. He was tall and not ugly at all, and it seemed that he was telling the truth and had no interest in harming her. Seeing her calm down, Seth was glad that the voice of Seth worked as intended. Knowing she was not a fanatic believer made talking to her much easier. As much as I would like to wait until the charm wears off, we don't have the time. You probably have duties to attend to, right? Ah, why yet? Oh no, I'm running late. But will you let me go? Seth stepped closer and looked her deep in her maroon eyes. Her breath quickened. Just promise me you won't tattle on me. I will stay here and hide and neither of us has to get into trouble. She felt a warmth in her stomach. Why yes, I promise, she hurriedly said. The nun distractedly tried to open the door and flee. Seth calmly unlocked the door for her and let her run off. When she was finally gone, Seth blushed furiously. He felt so embarrassed. He had largely simply followed Al Salzar's lead on this one. Sure, it was his idea to romance her, but it didn't he had planned to act like this. Well done, my young Padawan. But are you sure she won't report you? I followed your lead, if it didn't work it's your fault. But I think, well I hope she won't. It's not like she will get away scot-free if an intruder is found in her room, even if she is the one reporting it, right? Maybe. Seth could change it now. Considering this was a whole big accident and he had improvised to fix it, the result was good. All they could do now was wait. He laid down on the slim bed and thought about what happened. His best guess was still that the helm of Hades in a duration and a cool down. If he was right, he would just have to wait for it to come off cooldown. Until then he would have to stay in the nun's room. She called herself a non-believer, maybe he could turn her into a spy and get information from her? As he lay there, he slowly felt the fatigue catch up with him. He didn't sleep so well in that storeroom and the tiredness made the bed feel almost comfortable. Leaving the guard to the lich and fell asleep. Wake up! Someone is coming. HNG? How long was I gone for? A few hours. The door opened and the nun stepped inside. She meticulously locked the door and then leaned with her back against it. She looked at Seth with determined eyes. I have decided. After what has happened this morning, you will have to marry me, she stated. What? Seth exclaimed and jumped off the bed. Seeing his panicked reaction, she couldn't hold her serious expression and started laughing. Her happy giggles filled the room. Haha, don't worry. It's a joke. Just a little revenge. We should talk. Chapter 309. Making a Plan, 2. Maybe we should start off with introductions? My name is Linri. He thought for a moment but ended up telling her his real name. Seth. He took into account that she might have some kind of curse magic working on a person's name. But, with the high magic protection he had, he decided to take the risk and be honest. Seth. Alright then, Seth. How can I help you and what do you have to offer? What can I offer you? Well, of course. You must have a goal, right? What's in it for me if I help you? What is it that you want? It felt like a back and forth and silence followed Seth's question. As if they were haggling, neither wanted to spill their price limit first. It took a moment before Linri finally broke out. I want to get out of here. I want to be free. And I mean free as in being able to walk around like a normal person and make my own decisions. I don't want to hide, and I definitely don't want to be anywhere near people with an agenda. Seth stared at her, surprised by the sudden outburst. This sounded like she had bottled up these emotions for quite some time. It seems like that was in there for a long time. Care to elaborate? Can you offer me that, or not? Theoretically, yeah. That is if we succeed. It kept going back and forth like this until both finally had a picture of the other's motives and goals. Linri was from a world dominated by the theocracy of chains. She was the child of normal citizens, but her family had forced her to enter a monastery for fooling around with a slave. She hadn't even gotten to do anything before her parents cut her off. The societal structure of the theocracy was extremely rigid and even a simple citizen's life could be ruined if rumors like this made the round. As if it wasn't enough that she was kicked out by her own family, he had been forced to serve the god responsible for this. She had barely gotten any education as a priestess before she was added to this expedition. Her duty was to oversee the servants on their duties. Her situation felt hopeless until she was approached by the resistance. A group of people with the goal to sabotage the expansion and the abolition of slaves. She had no other choices and ended up joining them. But this wasn't it. Linri was no idealist. She knew herself well enough. She didn't care about the slaves or what happened to the theocracy. She wanted to get away and not be part of some stupid underground movement. It explained her outbreak earlier. Listening to Seth talk about Delta, where different races mixed in a much more modern and free society, gave her motivation. She was ready to work hard so she could do what she wanted. It was a much better perspective than becoming a terrorist and fighting a regime. On the other hand, Seth could gain a covered collaborator. Information on the outlay and command structure was good. Most importantly, Linri knew had access to the rebel information network. All at a price that Seth technically cost nothing. And he could stay in her room and hide until the Helm of Hades came off its cooldown. After they came to an agreement, Linri was able to supply Seth with all the information about the Stronghold's defense forces, the location of the suppressive field generator's nucleus, and even the space lock's setup. The places that could have taken the longest for Seth to find on his own. She also knew the guard shifts, the activity of the angels, the people in charge of the wardens, and the location of the rift. A permanent entrance to the pathworks is kept open by a magic formation. All of these locations were the basic information the rebels had to know on cue for their plans to sabotage this operation. As Linri had completely joined Seth, she didn't hold back anything and also revealed the rebels' plan of action. Their plan was quite similar to what Seth had been thinking about, but there were also points outside of Seth's consideration. The rebels had a way to seal the rift. And they planned to rely on the other races in the dungeon. It was their racial traits that made them able to resist the divine powers similar to champions of gods that could not be suppressed. Seth had no idea that this was the reason why they were tortured down there. It was to break their will. The rough outline of the rebels' plan was to cut off the connection to the pathworks when most of the angels and their leader left to report. At the same time, they closed the rift, they would free the captives and kill the priests. Without anyone to give orders, the slaves would not fight. With the rift sealed and the priests gone, they would have the time to free the slaves. What made Seth suspicious was that they didn't plan to get rid of the suppression field. Linri was only a newly joined member, so she was not privy to the details of what came after the stage where she played a role. Seth decided that he would have to meet these people and hijack their plan. The blacksmith and the nun talked about what to do. Until the Helm of Hades came off cooldown, he would stay in her room and hide. If Seth was not completely off, his disappearance would soon be noticed. This was their chance to start cooperating with the rebels. Evening. Is what you say true? The leader of the cell, Maino, asked Linri insistently. It was outside of his expectation that anyone really managed to flee with their own power. Linri had reported that she had found a runaway blacksmith from the prisoners was hiding in her chamber. She only repeated what Seth had told her to. He was a skilled blacksmith who managed to flee from his cell thanks to the effects of his items. And he thinks you are a simple priestess. He forced his way into my room this morning. He seemed quite driven. For now, I pretended to let him stay out of kindness and consideration. I see, good work. I will have someone check the prison cells for anomalies. If what he says is true, he might be worth recruiting. A little later, all rebels were assembled in their headquarters, one of the many storage cellars that normally only servants would enter. Maino had an announcement to make. I will get straight to the point. We have to act faster than expected. A blacksmith managed to escape from the prison blocks. Thanks to Linri, we knew this before the theocracy found out. When they find out someone managed to flee, all our work until now will be for naught. We know that they will find out at the latest tomorrow morning when they come to get the blacksmith's products. I called you all to make a decision. We have two choices. The first is to sacrifice the blacksmith. We put him back in the cell and he will probably be punished for not having the items ready in time. In exchange, we could wait to conduct our plan as intended. Otherwise, we have to do it tonight. It will be more dangerous but also not the worst moment. The worst of them, the Archangel is currently not on this world, while the angels have been spread to expedition forces. If we manage to take control in a quick action, those angels will only meet a huge enemy force when they return. What do you say? Murmuring filled the room as close to 30 people started talking. Some had enough of pretending and wanted to end it tonight. Others were more careful, not ready to sacrifice someone but concerned about the return of the angels. Seth stood behind Linri, completely invisible, and whispered her in the ears. "We should do it tonight. Don't worry about the returning angels. Don't forget the blacksmith. He told me he was making adamantium swords. If we arm our forces with weapons of that level, we won't need to fear something like the angels." She kept speaking up in favor of doing it tonight and soon most agreed with her, except for the hardcore critics. "I heard your opinion. Then we will hurry our plans and strike tonight. Now get going before anyone becomes suspicious. I will send the signal when everything is ready." Maino finally dismissed the meeting and the rebels left to their duties or rooms. Everyone left except for some invisible blacksmith. He stood in a corner and kept observing Maino. Everyone except 4 shadow figures who stepped into the light behind the rebel leader. "Tisk, those hot-headed idiots," he cursed. "But isn't this why you recruited them?" one of the figures asked. "Idealists are quite gullible," another mentioned. "Easy to manipulate as long as you feed them what they want to hear," a third confirmed, nodding. "What do you think? Can you manage to finish rebinding the creatures until morning?" "No problem, we were almost done anyways." "But what about the slaves?" a fourth confirmed. "We will have to do that afterward. It's not like those puppets will have a choice." "And that blacksmith? What about him?" "It's just a blacksmith. Even if his skills were unsealed, I wouldn't be afraid of a bunch of trifle and trinkets." Seth listened in on their little scheme and left when he was sure of how to hijack their plans. Chapter 310. Things that go thump in the night. In the upper floors, dark figures had appeared and carefully snuck around the rooms of the high-ranking priests. On the second to highest floor, one of the figures that had spoken with Maino got ready to assassinate the chained apostles stationed in the stronghold. It entered the first room. It moved towards the bed like a shadow, his dagger at ready to strike the sleeping apostle. But before the dagger could take the life, the figure stepped back in surprise and confusion. The bed was drenched in blood and the apostle was already dead. Somebody had beaten him to the punch. The shadow checked the corpse and found it was already turning rigid. It had been at least an hour since the priest died. His eyes widened and the figure rushed out of the room and checked the next one. This one was already dead, too. In shock, the shadow found all his targets already dead. Something was going wrong. He had to report. On the way down he came across other rebels cluelessly leaving rooms. It was not only him. None of the assassins could do their work, as their targets had long been finished off by someone else. The shadow collected these stragglers and led them to hurriedly report to their leader. Dungeons. The guards lay on the floor with their throats slit. Same with the torturers in the cells. The people in charge of rescuing the prisoners were puzzled but didn't mind having their work eased. They recovered the prisoners and heard stories of torturers' throats suddenly opening on their own as if killed by a divine force. While they were freeing the prisoners and giving them medical attention, other people were also working hard. 2 of Mino's henchmen were currently inside the cells of the mindless chimeras. The creatures did neither move nor react to their presence as they enchanted the collars of the beasts in silence. "Let me guess, rebinding means you are registering a new master, right?" They suddenly heard a curious voice ask. There was nobody and they couldn't make out where the voice came from. "No need to look for me." One of them could feel a big boot smashing into his stomach. More terrifying than the mere kick was the sudden shockwave that ran through his body and shattered the bones of his torso. This was the power of the Quake Bronze Seth had added to his disruptor boots. He could use the shockwave skill directly on people. In this case, the damage of the shockwave was based on his strength stat, which had become tremendous lately. The poor caster's body had no chance withstanding it. Seeing his friend deconstruct and crumble in front of his eyes planted terror in the leftover shadow. He couldn't see, nor detect the enemy otherwise, while the enemy could easily kill him. He made a sensible choice. "I surrender, please spare me," he knelt down and exclaimed. "Tell me what you were planning." Mino's plan was simple. He wanted to take over this colony. It was true that he was once part of the rebels, but he joined for the power. Why would he still try to free people with the possibility to establish his own kingdom of slaves? With the chimeras rebound to him as their master, he had enough force to get rid of any opposition, and then he could rebind the helpless warriors, magicians, and workers who lost their masters, too. They had joined his scheme and had gotten rid of anyone opposing them to gain a high position in this new land. "I told you everything I know, please spare my life." "Silence," answered the henchman. Was the powerful person gone? Had he survived? A smile appeared on his lips when the thought of flight came to his mind. Suddenly he felt a hand grasping his forehead. Terrible pain and heat filled the last moments of his life before pale blue flames turned him into ashes. A wince came from the man on the ground when he saw what happened to his companion. He couldn't move. He couldn't even feel anything below his neck, but he was still alive. Tears shot into his eyes when he felt a palm lay on his head. No flames came. Weariness called him and he fell into a slumber. The light vanished from his eyes and Seth harvested the souls. Just like he did with every apostle and priest on his way down. With the rebels' information and preparations, it had been a lot easier for Seth. He had copied their homework and completely stole the credit for it. Your plan? No, you mean my plan. It was at this moment that the alarm sirens sounded. The rebels had killed the guards and sealed off the rift. Perfect timing. All Seth had to do now was break the nucleus of the suppression field and then his own preparations would come to fruition. He would have liked to get rid of the chimeras then and there, but he had doubts. Maybe these people still had a mind and a will to live. He couldn't be sure whether they were allies or enemies until he removed the collar. That's why he decided to spare them, for now. To reach the nucleus Seth had to retrace his steps, as it was situated all the way at the top of the highest tower. They had really put it in the completely opposite place of what Seth had expected. Really? Who puts something so precious into such a vulnerable place? Seth could only shake his head as he walked past all the magical safety measures. How careless not to think of a completely invisible and undetectable enemy. His complacency only held up until he came before a door. Al detected all kinds of measures which would ring the alarm if the door was opened incorrectly. And then his complacency continued. How very careless of them, not to take into account someone with the ultimate master key to open any door flawlessly. He unlocked the door without a hitch and continued on his way. He argued that it had probably been a waste to use his one daily use on the door, considering the stronghold was already on alarm since the rebels sealed the rift. On the other hand, who knew who or what would come up here if the alarm sounded? He could see the rebels and a few of the chimeras struggle against those creepy wardens and human guards. Struggle because there were also a few of those metallic angels harvesting lives. Something to point out was, that the chimeras did not differentiate between the rebels, other races, and the theocracy's forces. That rebel leader is probably getting rid of his unneeded subordinates. Seth only nodded. He ascended a short flight of steps and finally came before the nucleus. Like a giant light bulb in a lighthouse, it levitated in the middle of the round room. It was one of the 4 highest towers and Seth knew from Linry that one of the others held the center of the space lock. He only understood the reason why they had put these important things so high up when he looked down at the battlefield. It wasn't just the unsettling angels, even the insect-like warden had set off the ground and flew with pitch-black insect wings. They had air superiority. It was a lot easier to defend something like these towers than to fight on the ground and protect something subterranean like the dungeons. No wonder they needed slaves and chimeras to act as ground soldiers. As much as he would have liked to see the church's forces and the chimeras wipe each other out, he saw Toho and some people of the other races wreak havoc on the battlefield. They were the smallest forces down there and Seth didn't really want to lose them yet. He had to hurry. Al Salzar wanted to give him minute instruction of how to shut down the nucleus. I will just set it on fire. It will be a lot faster. No. We don't know if that will work. There could be residual effects if it isn't shut down correctly. Let it burn. I will end everything in a sea of fire. Stop with the jokes and get to work. Sure. Seth followed the expert's advice and dismantled the thing as best as they were able to. Even the Lich was not 100% sure what they were doing. But finally, after a few minutes of work Seth could feel the pressure lift like a heavy blanket. The suppression had lifted together with a shrill alarm sound emitted from the tower. The battlefield came to a stop as everyone hesitated for just a moment when they heard this alarm. Especially the theocracy's forces. It was time for Seth's preparations to bear fruit. Chapter 311. Eventful Night. Marcel, the leader of the Volcano Guild, and Elsa, from the Mutin Guild, stood side by side among the group of captives that had previously been abducted and split into warriors and magicians. They had lived the last 2 weeks as puppets, forced to follow any command of their captors. Marcel had mostly stood guard day and night. Even when he felt like passing out from fatigue, the alien curse kept him awake. He had already been close to losing his sanity. But he felt like he still had it good. In the Ice Queen's eyes burned a fire fueled by pain and hatred so deep, Marcel couldn't possibly understand. It had only been 2 hours since this nightmare was alleviated. Just 2 hours ago a priest had hurriedly woken them up from the little bit of sleep they were allowed to have. Profusely sweating, he was babbling something about a rebellion and to get ready for battle just before an invisible blade split him apart. Behind him stood just a nun, before suddenly a man appeared beside her. A man calling himself a blacksmith and master of Mina's march. He used their inability to act on their own to explain his crazy plan of freeing them all. Only after he finished speaking did he start breaking the collars one by one using an eerie flame on his finger like a plasma cutter. Their part in the plan was relatively simple. Get geared up, wait for his signal, and smash all the enemies in their path. Marcel liked this. Once the enemy was subjugated, they would proceed to free all the other slaves. It wasn't enough to say that everyone agreed. Everyone was eager to get revenge. Especially those who had been slaves for longer than those abducted from the stadium. There were quite a few that were not even from Earth. They settled on an easy command structure. Marcel, as a prominent guild master, would lead the warriors from Delta. Elsa would lead the caster from Earth for a similar reason. Those without connections to Earth chose 2 leaders among themselves. It was simply easier that way. Like this, the roughly 400 people present at the dormitories had split into 4 troops of slightly differing sizes. After explaining everything to them, the man had turned invisible again and left them with the nun, who led them to the armory. After upgrading their equipment from the crappy stuff they had to wear as slave soldiers, all they had to do was wait for the signal and join the battle on the side of the rebels. Marcel even managed to secure some of his original armor. Overall, plundering the armory led to an upgrade for most of the people present. They were motivated to fight and eagerly waited for the signal. Elsa and Marcel used the time to consult with the leaders of the foreigners and came up with a formation for all of them. They had barely put some structure in their troops when they felt a pressure lifting together with a shrill alarm that suddenly filled the stronghold. Just like the blacksmith had promised, their connection with the system had reconnected. They hurriedly got in position as they expected the signal to come soon. And they were right. Just moments later 2 huge pale blue fireballs exploded in the night sky like fireworks. In the courtyard below, where the rift had been active previously, Seth could see almost orderly rows of adventurers and their pets fall into the flanks of the Chimeras and Theocracy's troop who had cornered the rebels. Their ongoing survival was thanks to Duhu and the other foreign races who performed a lot better than anyone had expected. Their level, their skills, their gear, and most importantly their overwhelming motivation to level this place and anyone responsible for it turned these forces into an unstoppable murder mob. The Chimeras? What Chimeras? The Warden? Who? Nothing could resist their waves of sword and magic as they systematically tore their tormentors apart. Seth felt somewhat awkward watching them like this and soon tore his gaze away from the scene. There was something else he had to do now. Find Maino and get rid of him. With him, the Chimeras would lose their owner and probably stop moving. Time for the cloak of Hecate to shine. He pulled down the hood and concentrated on his target. Seth would have liked a quest marker, but it was more like a game of warm and cold. He had a hunch which direction to go, though it wasn't always easy to decide which was warmer. It didn't take too long, but with the battle raging outside it felt like ages. After taking a few wrong turns here and there he finally found a figure cowardly shooting a bow from one of the windows. Maino. Seth breathed into the room. In shock and surprise, the traitorous rebel leader turned around only to look into an empty room. The next moment an invisible blade stabbed his chest. It was a truly heart-rending experience right before departing the world of the living. Well, that was anticlimactic, Seth thought to himself. What wasn't anticlimactic was the army of chimeras suddenly coming to a standstill. They ceased any movements and stood there mindlessly like they had in the dungeons. Under the joint forces of the adventurers and the rebels, the last human followers in the inner yard of the stronghold lost their lives. What remained were the wardens and angels that had fled to the sky. The wardens were strong, but their numbers dwindled under the constant barrage from the enraged mob below. The only persistent thread were the angels who displayed high resistance to magic and physical damage. They were comparable to mini-bosses. And there were still 4 of them left. Nevertheless, the troops on the ground had the advantage and sieged them motivated by the visibly accumulating damage they caused. Everything was going as planned and it didn't seem like he would have to personally intervene. Seth started relaxing. It was a shame that the people of the Theocracy did not give experience, otherwise everyone in the courtyard could have made a few levels. The people of the Theocracy were just like the beasts in the fog dimension. He had been very disappointed when he found out. Killing the priests neither gave him notification or experience. That was why Seth decided to harvest their souls. He wanted to gain at least something from this arduous work. The problem was that the souls of priests were tainted by the power of their god. It was like how children would scribble their names on their toys. It was an imprint as if they had sold their soul to a demon. Seth doubted this would have a positive effect on items. The chance of the items having an effect of 100% hostility with theocracy of chains was very high. Or one may become the sworn enemy of a god just by wearing the item. Aren't we going to help them? My tremendous powers have grown past anything you could fathom. This me could easily take down one of those shiny robots. Puffles interjected. Their connection had finally reconnected after the suppression was lifted and they could communicate again. The Eye-Visor seemed to itch for a fight. I know, but we have another place to visit. Seth had to disappoint the caterpillar. Seeing everything slowly coming to an end, he left when he saw the first angel fall from the sky. At the storage rooms in the servant quarters, he met up with Linry. This was something Seth had been itching to do since he came across. All in all, Seth looted several dozen crates filled to the brim with high-quality steel. Just where did they get this much, he mumbled absent-mindedly as he kept storing the crates in his inventory. During the initial construction of the stronghold, the scouts found vast resources of good quality iron in the surrounding ruins. The first task of the slaves was actually to harvest the surrounding iron for building materials. Linry suddenly mentioned. Have you been here for that long? Me? No. But I heard about it. A lot of the iron was sent back until they lost too many slaves out there. One of the others mentioned that the big road was probably to harvest this place more efficiently. I see. Let's keep going. I am done here. On the way to the next place, they came across a few guards and priests who had just returned to the stronghold after hearing the alarms. They departed, the moment they saw Linry. The place they arrived at was the stronghold's smithy. The official one. It was a big workshop with high-grade crafting stations, and equipment. The room was dark, the forge was cold, and nobody could be seen. Under Seth's flames the reinforced steel door covered in magic symbols turned into a puddle of molten slag. Neither the material nor the enchantments could withstand the determined blacksmith, and he didn't mind the alarms going off. It had been the last barrier. Behind the now liquefied door was the material storage of the smithy. Although their work was not over when the angels were defeated, Seth was sure many of the adventurers outside would devolve into a looting mob once the immediate danger was gone. As the main actor in this play, he wanted to make sure to secure his fee before the curtain fell. Chapter 312. Nothing good happens past 2 a.m. Although the storage couldn't compare to the diversity of Tord's treasure trove of materials, Seth was very much satisfied with the contents. The theocracy must have had a way to reliably produce artificial adamantium because there were tons of the precious metal here. Almost 150 billion Argentine pesos were divided into several crates like the one he was given to work with. On top of this there were several boxes of dark steel, magic steel, stacks of different woods, and even mithril. But in the back corner of the storage room waited another surprise. There sat a young dwarf with a short beard. A thick golden slave collar decorated his neck. Although his expression was frozen, he was hugging his knees and shaking in fear. He reminded Seth of his time in Aura and the friends he had made. A dwarf? They even got their hands on a dwarf, he thought. Seth took off the helm of Hades and put it in his inventory, before approaching him. Don't worry, he spoke in a calm manner and knelt down beside the young dwarf. He was probably not much older than Seth. He burned through the ring and took it off the dwarf's neck. Immediately the dwarf's face distorted in glee, sadness, and joy, and tears ran down his cheeks. All the emotions he could show before broke out at once. Later Seth found out that the dwarf's father had been the blacksmith of the stronghold but finally died of exhaustion after weeks of almost no break. This was the reason that Seth was given the ambiguous chance to enter the stronghold in the first place. Thank you, he exclaimed and hugged his savior's waist. It's okay now. You can come along with us once we emptied this place. What about her? He pointed at Linry with some fear. She's not part of them. We are in the middle of ending this place. The dwarf was still doubtful of the nun, but he nodded and waited while Seth packed away all the materials in the shelves and boxes. Arim, wait. The dwarf stopped them when they wanted to leave after emptying the room. There is more. It's just, I can't open the door. It needs a special authority token. A hidden door? Can you show me? Seth asked while rummaging through a satchel at his belt. The dwarf pointed at an unassuming part of the wall and his eyes widened when he saw what Seth did. The blacksmith pulled out a whole bundle of over 200 pieces of jewelry, talismans, and authority tokens from the bag on his belt. He had looted anything that looked somewhat valuable and could be grabbed quickly from those priest rooms and shoved it into this bag. Now he shoved a fistful of who knew what exactly was in there, against that part of the wall. Nothing happened at first, so he started rubbing the bungled of stuff all over the part of the wall until suddenly the outline of a door lit up and opened. Inside was a small room with a few boxes and smaller chests. Looking through the boxes, Seth found the truly precious stuff. Fey steel, adamantium, monocrystal, and gems for magician equipment. There were even materials he didn't know, like something called faulty ithilden and impulse silver. He had never heard of impulse silver, but he knew that ithilden was supposed to be a refined form of mithril. He had never seen it even in the auction house. Faulty ithilden was epic rated, and it confirmed to Seth that this theocracy had a high knowledge in metallurgy, or they had a slave with it. A powerful rumble interrupted his thoughts. Earlier in the courtyard, the terrifying chimeras had really stopped moving, just like promised. Marcel and the leader of the Freed commanded the vanguard to ignore the abominations that had become motionless and pressed onto the leftover humans and wardens. Elsa and the other ranged adventurers kept the angels at bay, while the Freed magicians used group rituals to carpet bomb the ground forces from the rear. The wardens, towering over the masses by several meters, were easily comparable to an Leave 70 or 80 dungeon boss, but even the guards of the theocracy were tenacious. However, without the constant threat of the chimeras, they had the upper hand and could slowly push them back. When the first wardens finally started dying, these giant insectoid warriors suddenly spread their pairs of gargantuan wings and lifted up in the air. Without their support, the command structure among the guards and their spirits soon started collapsing. As they died in troves, many fled back into the hallways. Marcel stopped anyone from giving chase and told them to concentrate on the wardens and angels in the air, instead. He knew that those guards would not get far. Although Seth had not told them to, Marcel, Elsa and the leader of the Freed had decided to split some of their forces to secure the stronghold. These freed people had been slaves for years and had been forced to work in this place since it was built a few months ago. They knew the makeup and the security measures. When most of the guards had assembled in this courtyard because of the alarm, part of the Freed had already split off to hinder any attempt to call for reinforcements from the worker camps outside and secured all important gateways. No matter where those Guers ran, they would only meet a cruel death. Convinced of their plan, Marcel led the other to siege the angels in the sky. The ranged attackers and mages took the lead in damage output against this flying menace. Some of the vanguards like him could use a few ranged skills, while the rest concentrated on protecting them from dives or ranged attacks. Although it took a while, the adventurers preferred this fight of attrition. The angels had incredibly high stats, but the mine seemed rather simple. The wardens were similar. Without someone giving them commands, it wasn't hard to read their patterns. For the adventurers who spent endless hours in the dungeons, these were dangerous, but not hard opponents, and soon the first and second angels fell. But then something changed. The other three angels recovered their fallen brethren's bodies and the leftover wardens surrounded them. They summoned a crimson shield that blocked them from attacks and sight. A bad feeling grew in everyone who saw this. Whatever these things tried to do, they had to stop it. It was clear to all of them, and they concentrated their attacks on the crimson bubble in the sky. But every time they managed to slightly damage the barrier, it would be repaired by a stream of energy that was extracted from the dead guards and warden on the ground. Even in death, their duty didn't end. Obviously, the adventurers tried to destroy the bodies on the ground. It only led to the barrier absorbing the destroyed corpses anyway and becoming stronger. Whether adventurers or freed people, they were all exhausted from the battle, and their damage output could not keep up with the shield's absorption. What was left was to helplessly watch the bubble grow as the corpses on the ground vanished. At some point, when the corpses were all gone, it started to pulsate. The rhythmic thumps, like those of a nightmarish heart, rumbled through the stronghold. Each beat was like a hit on the chest to the exhausted audience. They all got headaches, and those with a weaker physique knelt on the ground holding their head or stomach. Most of the asters were out for the count, and even the warriors like Marcel felt the effects. The beat stopped when a giant pale fireball engulfed the shield and turned it into a white sun above the courtyard. The immense heat made the adventurers step back. For moments the fire burned furiously, and then the bubble popped. Nobody had time to cheer, because they could now see what was on the inside. It was hard to describe. It was a ball of wings with innumerable eyes. All of it in the same metallic sheen as the angels. The eyes opened and the gaze of amber orbs fell onto the people below. A terrifying pressure gave them the urge to kneel, and they had a hard time moving at all. Even worse was that the chimeras started to move again. As if woken from a slumber, they started to clumsily form orderly rows, ready to attack the rebel forces. I am Lehelephon, throne of the bringer of chains. Bow and accept your destiny. A deep voice bellowed through their consciousness. The next moment magic circles started forming in the air. Hinges, nails, the equipment left by the dead guard, things of metal in the vicinity were all sucked up into these formations. Even the items people got from the armory got ripped out of their hands or stripped from their bodies. Everything merged together in these formations and the shapeless metal balls turned into newborn angels. Resistance is futile. Chapter 313. Of Angels and Demons. They were completely exhausted and now they were confronted by an army of chimeras, a bunch of fresh angels, and something on the scale of an end boss. To make matters worse, the formations did not stop sucking in metal and creating more angels. This was their hour of despair mere moments after they saw victory at the horizon. Many were heavily wounded and the pressure of the throne's eyes pinned them to the ground. He had survived and endured being a slave for decades. Watching his family get killed, his children abused. Never able to do anything. He even had to protect the scum that tortured him. Today had been supposed to be the day of his revenge, but reality once again showed him his own weakness. Now he lay on the ground, squeezed by an insurmountable power, and he felt his life slowly ooze out of his body. With each beat of his heart, he slowly bled out. Only despair waited for him in the darkness behind his eyelids as he steadily inched closer to death. In his foggy mind, he could hear an impish voice. It was a lazy sing-song in an alien language, but he could clearly understand the question. All the questions, over and over. Do you want power? Would you give your life for revenge? What would you do to be able to stand up and fight? Are you willing? Are you sure? No matter the price, you are willing to pay. Everything. He was about to die, what was his life worth? If he could stand up to this power. If he could take revenge. Memories of his family flashed through his mind and what they had done to them. No price was too high. The sing-song changed to a background noise and a dark voice. Good, then take my power. If you can. The price has already been paid. Moments earlier. Al, can you take that thing? They were standing at a window in a hallway from where Seth had cast the fireball at the giant bubble. Seth was invisible again while Linry and the dwarf were hiding behind the windowsill. It seemed like he had been too late to stop whatever happened. Really, he only left for like 5 minutes and everything went to shit. I'm pretty sure I can kill that mess of wings, but you guys will have to take care of the angels. Leave it to me. I shall prove to you my greatness once and for all. Can you take care of the formations? PFF, easy. Okay, give me a moment to prepare, I have an idea to buff our numbers. Maybe. He told Linry and the dwarf to hide in an adjacent room and not listen to anything they may hear before he started. He sat down cross-legged with his finger knotted in a bizarre way. With his head jerking from left to right like a metronome, he started humming a madness-inducing tune. It wasn't loud but easily penetrated through even the thickest walls. It was a ballad he had learned for combat because he felt a connection to this demon. As it was not a forging ballad, he could barely use this rare song with all his skills combined. It was a rhyme praising Zaphon, the burning skies. With this ballad, the bard could strengthen the power of a party's fire magic. Originally, that is. Seth had a different plan. The idea was based on his experience with the demonic ballads and divine enchantments after becoming an infernal skald. Especially his encounter with Hermes. If he was cocky enough, he could try and haggle with these existences. Using soul trade he felt confident enough to try it, at least with a demon. In this case, the rhyme acted as the phone number while channeling was the line. As one of the greater and older demons known, the effect of the ballad descended automatically and Seth could feel the power that came through the connection created by channeling. But this was just the answering machine. How could he reach the actual person? He kept up the chant and concentrated on the connection created by channeling. Seth tried to force more mental energy and mana into the passive skill. The skill had leveled up during the last 2 weeks and he felt like he got closer to something. Ding! Your skill channeling leave 4 had become channeling leave 5. What previously felt like a tube that was too thin to take the energy he was trying to force into it, now happily accepted the power and an image appeared in Seth's mind. He saw a gargantuan humanoid figure sitting on a throne made of molten stone in the middle of a burning realm. The throne was levitating in the sky as lava flowed into the abyss below. He was surrounded by clouds of fire and smoke, but he didn't look too majestic. He sat crookedly on the throne with his legs swinging over the armrest. His empty stare looked into the distance in boredom until he noticed the tiny presence of Seth. A petitioner coming here with a proposition. When his gaze fell on the blacksmith, he felt a terrible heat piercing into his very soul and scanning his mind. There was no way for Seth to resist such a big shot, but it caused no harm to him. I like your disp Ostchen. State you business. Seth concentrated on his intention using voice of Seth without changing the text of the rhyme. What are you willing to pay? These souls are branded. The price will double in that case. With tears flowing down his face, Seth used all the hard-earned priest souls to pay the demon god his fee. Good. Now don't resist. I will use you as a mouthpiece. As his voice, tune, and the song changed to an almost inaudible whisper, Seth summoned Alsalzar and Puffles, the Great. No matter what had happened that day, the Eye-Visor would stay the greatest surprise for Seth. Jet flames of black fire and the stench of sulfur and smoke were their signals to attack. Courtyard. Fire filled his mind with unworldly pain. As his mind was filled with screams, so was his body as the hellish fire feasted on flesh and vaporized everything that had been him. When it burned all the way down to his very soul, he lost consciousness. The embers gnawed into his soul like a swarm of termites as their channels formed three-dimensional runes that chained him to his new god. The flames had just shot up, but a new servant of Zaphon already opened his eyes. It had only been moments since he burned. Looking at his hand, he found them completely unharmed. It was just that they had become orange-red demon arms with long black nails. Even though he became a servant and owed allegiance to the demon god, it was different from being a slave. The only command that was given to him during his rebirth was to fulfill the desires he had before his death. And he was not the only one. All of them were different, all of them had different reasons or desires when they accepted the trade. They were all the same, as the only command they had was to fulfill their own goal. Almost 30 newborn demons had been spawned onto the battlefield among the kneeling and desperate people. The gaze of Lehilaphon had no effect on them, which aggravated the ball of metal feathers. Who dares interfere with his will? It commanded the angels to attack the demons, who clad themselves into dark flames and instinctively started attacking the dozens of angels. Lehilaphon had no time to prepare an attack of his own, as a curvy figure appeared before its eyes. A powerful spell suddenly sealed the throne and it felt the power of space pulling it away. The giant angel made of feathers and eyes vanished from the stronghold. In its stead, a giant creature suddenly broke through one of the walls of one of the buildings. A giant white centipede as big as a train broke through the wall and started climbing a tower with its sharp silver legs smashing into massive stone walls like they were tofu. Marcel and the other had no idea what was going on anymore. They could only look in shock as the demons engaged the angels and chimeras in battle. It took them a while to notice that the pressure had vanished with Lehilaphon, and those who could, stood up to fight. Seth could only watch the battle unfold from the giant hole Puffles had left when he charged up the tower. Being the mouthpiece of a demon god had completely exhausted his mana and mental energy. He could only sit there, drink potions and wait for his energy to recover. Chapter 314. Predatory Caterpillar. The walls crumbled like cake as Puffles rushed up the tower, leaped off the tip, and flew. Like a dragon, he cut through the air and charged at the formations left in the sky, who kept pulling up all kinds of metals to constantly create angels. The Eye-Visor had far surpassed the holy beast Seth had met in the ruins of Eye-Vice and was close to 20 meters long, comparable to a train on legs. Puffles was still smaller than the giant leader of their race Cernobulk, but other than that he was fully grown. The two pairs of terrifying sickle arms glinted in the night as a golden set of runes blazed in his neck shield. A golden magic circle appeared and he brutally smashed into the formations, breaking them apart with brute force. Like a game of hoops, he wound through the air and smashed them one by one. The newly born angels obviously didn't just watch, those who had not rushed into battle yet returned to stop the flying centipede. Resistance was futile. The human-sized messengers of God attacked with metal spear and alien magic, but nothing could even so much as harm the thick porcelain-like carapace. Like the neck shield, golden symbols and patterns glowed on the white shell that easily negated incoming magic attacks. Puffles, the Great, ignored the flies and continued crashing into and destroying the angel spawners, cutting off their source of reinforcement. Only when the last one was gone did he turn his attention to the pesky critters that tried to stop him. While the nightmare centipede was wreaking havoc in the skies, the ground was a chaotic mess. People tried their best to resist chimeras they had previously ignored, but like Seth, their reserves were completely exhausted. Marcel and the adventurers had grouped with the humanoids and the rebels. They already had a hard time just keeping their lives, not to mention fighting back or gaining the upper hand. Even the massive tiger, Dohu, who kept one-shotting the chimeras in the beginning, was covered in wounds and could barely resist the onslaught of abominations. The only glimmer of hope was funny enough the demons that had randomly appeared among them. Clad in unholy flames they had rushed into the enemy ranks like juggernauts. Those not locked in battle with angels kept ripping apart chimeras as if they were made of paper. Wherever they went, huge plumes of tainted fire bloomed and ate away at the masses of chimeras. The survivors were already getting their hopes up when they noticed that more and more of these creatures kept pouring out of the depths of the stronghold. Previously, there had only been the chimeras that Maino controlled. Lehilaphon on the other hand was able to control all chimeras in the dungeons and had called them to battle before Al attacked him. As such, they kept pouring from the entrances into the courtyard, filling up the ranks every time the demons killed some of them. Everyone's heart sank when the giant nightmare in the sky dived down, and they didn't really calm down even when the creature it snatched up was an angel. Puffles had almost inaudibly come up behind one of the metallic flies that was fighting a demon. The creature made of an alloy that even withstood the strength and heat of the demon fire-clad claws was skewered by one of the scythe-like appendages. The Ivisor's sickles cut through their body as if they were tofu. The audience's heart audibly hit the ground when the squirming angel was shoved headfirst into the gob of the flying train. With the giant golden mandibles, the still resisting prey was then cut off just above the waist. They all had a good view of the twitching lower body stuck on the sickle before it was also swallowed. All they could do was hope that it was an ally and not turn to them, once the angels ran out. While he had hunted and feasted on the angels in the sky, Puffles had developed a taste for these divine creatures. The magic alloy they consisted of was tasty and nutritious to him. He almost regretted having destroyed the spawners so quickly. But he had to hurry so he could enter the battle and save those people. Oh yeah! That was what he was supposed to do. The Ivisor halted in the air for just a moment, and the survivors in the back, who had the time to, looked at him with bated breath. The flying fiend was looking their way, right? Did it decide human meat would be tastier? The runes and pattern on the Ivisor's neck shield and along his body started glowing with unprecedented might and momentarily illuminated the dim battlefield. Puffles, the Great, full of honor, grace, and sense of duty, cast a transparent shield, shining with a golden light over the group of survivors. In one moment, the front line had been in a desperate struggle to keep the chimeras from breaking through, and in the next, they were standing behind a golden shield that easily blocked the attacks of the raving sea of bodies. In confusion, they looked for who had done it. They followed the gaze of their comrades and saw the giant centipede levitating above the battlefield. This should hold for 15 minutes. Just stay in there and wait for me to finish up. A voice spoke in their heads before the dragon pillar started moving again and returned to stealing angels from the demons and gobbling them up. Puffles judged that the shield would buy him enough time to finish his meal. Then he could return and protect them personally. Seth watched this with an awkward expression. He had a pretty good idea of Puffles' feelings and motivations through their connection. Seeing the survivors look up to the caterpillar with awe and admiration, while they were not more than an afterthought to the other, saddened him somehow. On the other hand, with every angel that vanished into the belly of the flying train, the number of demons on the battlefield grew. Chimeras died left and right and the dark flames spread across the courtyard. At this rate, the tide would turn again soon. Especially once Puffles joined the chaos again. Still, something was nagging on Seth's conscience. All of these chimeras were controlled, just like the slaves. Maybe they didn't even wish to fight them at all. Watching the battlefield, he had an idea. Seth threw 45 small, 37 medium, and 3 big common souls into Tisiphone's ring. These were all the souls he still had left. It became clear that the price for further improvement kept rising the greater the effect was. After infusing the big souls, the secondary effects also started increasing slightly. However, with all these, he only managed to slightly more than double the soul ring's effects. Seth felt slightly disappointed that the cost became this high so fast until he noticed that he checked his status and felt the other changes. Besides willpower, his agility and intelligence had also grown. By 200 points each. It was the set effect. He understood why the cost was so high. He didn't just improve Tisiphone's ring, but the whole Irene's set. Taking this into account, it only took double the initial cost to double the effects. Hearing the great crash, Seth looked up and saw that Puffles had started bombing the battlefield. In shock, he remembered why he was doing what he was doing and got into action. Stop the attacks? Oh. Of course, the Great Me has already predicted your plan. I will protect the poor sobs on the ground then. After strengthening the ring, it didn't only give him another 200 willpower, but the mental energy regeneration was increased by 25%. Now he felt up for the task and entered the battlefield. Chapter 315. Through the fire and flames. The courtyard filled with fire, blood, and the thick of the battle suddenly changed. In a surreal moment, for just a second, all flames stood still. Those who blinked missed the moment and opened their eyes to a battlefield almost devoid of fire. Even the demons stared in a stupor as they lost control of their own fire and the flames condensed into a wave of terrifying heat that swept over the courtyard. Without harming anyone, it continued on its path and vanished in the depths of the dungeons. Everyone was left behind in confusion. The humans, the demons, and even the chimeras had stopped for the seconds during which everything went down. When the spell finally lifted, hectic movement filled the courtyard. This was your plan? I mean, just as I had predicted. Yes, the Great Me saw this coming. In a panic, the surviving chimeras distanced themselves from the demons and started to flee. Their eyes filled with tears, confusion, and utter fear, the animal-based ones flooded back into any exit they could find in hysteria. When the exits were clogged and they could not push through, they started climbing over each other and the walls, finally pouring into the outer courtyard and further into the forest in the distance. Some with human intellect backed off, watching the demons and the giant centipede vigilantly. Most cowered in fear on the ground, crying and whining as they tried to understand what had happened to them. The smallest number of chimeras opted to attack the overwhelming enemy and lose their life in an act of despair. The wave of fire had burned away the slave collars and opened their minds to the questionable freedom of a life as an abomination. The demons were pondering what to do. As the chimeras were not controlled anymore, they lacked any will to fight. Most of them were former slaves, they understood the hopelessness of such an existence and were unwilling. But some of them were adventurers and people of Earth, who had not been slaves for as long. What are you all waiting for? Kill them while they don't resist, one of them asserted and summoned fireballs in his hands. However, when he tried to throw them, they simply puffed out of existence. Sorry, but I spend a lot of energy on that move to save them. I don't think I will let you go on a slaughter. A man with an ancient-looking helmet under his arm, wearing an expensive-looking armor, appeared in the courtyard. Who do you think you are to protect them? Have your eyes gone bad after I turned you into a demon? I'm the guy who freed you in the first place. Remember? I don't care. I now have the power to rise to the peak. I will stand atop the world. Why would I listen to you? He suddenly charged at the man with incredible speed and murderous intent. Serious? Okay, knock yourself out. Seth sighed. No good deed goes unpunished. He didn't attempt to dodge or even block. Seth saw it as a good opportunity to test his new equipment. The status of the demon given by observation seemed somewhat scrambled, but it showed it to be level 78. A difference of 28 in level was a huge gap, but Seth was confident to survive 1 or 2 strikes even without blocking or fighting back. His intention of taking the hit without moving faltered when his despicable opponent aimed for his face. The blacksmith crossed his arms to block the strike to his face. He gritted his teeth as the tremendous force of the impact numbed his arms. As he tried to secure his stance, the demon's other fist struck his cuirass and pressed the air out of his lungs. Seth coughed and gagged as he tried to breathe and stepped back. It would have been the perfect moment to end the fight, but while Seth was coughing and trying to gain back his breath, the demon was screaming and kneeling on the ground. It was holding the fragmented and mangled mess that was left of the forearm it had just struck with. Why isn't it healing? He cried, staring at it. He was right, these demons had immense regenerative abilities, but not only did it not heal, his flesh started turning grey and then a necrotic black. Seth kicked the distracted, kneeling demon in the face. The effect of the disruptor boots that had just recently mashed a priest's torso only amounted to breaking the demon's nose and jaw. It was more of a petty act because he was angry with himself than with the demon. Seth decided to never again take a hit just to see what would happen and proceeded to cut off the quickly decaying arm of the unconscious demon. At least he knew that he could theoretically take a hit from an opponent of this caliber, and his pyrokinesis had leveled up to 8 when he stole control of the flames and created the fire wave. Anybody else wants to step forward? Seth, it was Dohu who had returned to humanoid form and finally recognized him. Hey, Dohu. I'm glad you survived, but we can catch up later. There is a lot of stuff to do. First. Whump. A crumpled mass of twisted feather and gouged out eyes slammed into the courtyard behind Seth. Miraculously it didn't squash any of the chimeras or people. You owe me a lot for this. The spicy sorceress Alzalsa slowly levitated down to the ground. Her wide fluttery outfit was revealing, but even with the wind and air whipping around her, it never revealed too much. Don't I always owe you? It's different this time. If I wasn't weakened I had to burn some of my essence to take it down. That will cost you more than paying my visit to the red light district. Okay, okay. Can we talk about that later? When everything calmed down a little. Hump. Fine. Do what you have to do, I will go and rest. With that, she cancelled her summon and turned into smoke which returned to the token. She was really pissed this time and Seth felt slightly afraid of the price she would demand. A bunch of confused and curious eyes were now resting on him, and he harumphed to gloss over what just happened. First, we have to secure the stronghold. Nobody stopped Seth from taking command, while the blacksmith started delegating all the annoying management of the aftermath to others. After a small war council with the leaders, they all had their tasks. Seth spent some time on healing people using the effect of the Golden Fleece before they set off. Marcel and Elsa would take the adventurers and demons to help defend the gates. The remnants of the rebels would go to look after the servants. As part of the rebels' plot, the servant quarters had been sealed off so they would not suddenly have to fight a bunch of non-combatants. The freed people volunteered to try and talk with the intelligent chimeras. They had the best idea of what might be currently going on in their minds. This left Seth, Puffles, the chimeras, and the freed people in the courtyard without any task except healing the wounded. Arim, are you still going to eat that? Puff was poking at the mess of bent and twisted feather left of Lehilifon. Salvia was actually running from his mandibles as he stared at the divine alloy. You really gobbled down enough angels. I will store that away. Seth said hurriedly. If Puffles was this intent on eating it, it had to be something good. Yeah, you should keep that. It should be good for the new vessel you will make for me. Wah! Don't what me? That's the compensation I want. A new vessel, one made after my designs. Okay. You heard her. Puffles looked very sad with his big blue eyes but Seth could only pat its snout. Neither of them could go against the sorceress. Chapter 316. Somewhere else, 7. According to her map, she should have come across Epsilon already, but she kept traveling through an almost primeval-looking landscape filled with all kinds of giant and lately mutated-seeming beasts and lizards. At first, they had simply strong bodies and some had poisons but now more and more often they showed magical and mystical abilities that made her fights harder and harder. She still had not found where the flying person had come from and the doubts in her kept growing. Had she lost her way? She had been sure of her way before, but if she had not made any mistakes, she should have reached Epsilon by now. Deciding to trust her navigator skills she thought of other possibilities. There was another possibility. Looking at the surroundings it seemed like she had entered a different world. Maybe she did somehow stumble through a portal? Either that or someone had stolen a whole district. She had heard about how the Empire was able to shift a starter village to Earth. Had somebody maybe shifted Epsilon to a different world and left this unfamiliar piece of land in its stead? The Rakshasa decided to continue for a few more days in this direction and if she found nothing she would turn around and journey to the west. Pip had shown great talent in the 7 Saras and quickly mastered the 7 games. Today was her big day. She was going to become an apprentice of Karina today. Wearing a new robe, she walked up the path toward the great tree that protected their little world. She had seen this ceremony a few times ever since she had come to Karina's grove. The happiness of finally wearing the robe of an apprentice was overwhelming. The Dryad herself had given the robe to her. The fabric was incredibly soft and looked like a blanket of green and white leaves. Once she entered the Great Hall and completed the ceremony, she would enter a true connection with nature and be able to learn magic like the other apprentices. Pip walked through an alley by already established apprentices whom all greeted her with smiles. They all knew each other in their small community. She entered the hall, which was a circular room in the trunk of Karina's tree. She entered through a gate at the foot of the tree. In the middle of the tree hole was a great basin filled with transparent green liquid. Karina already waited for her in the middle of the pond. The Dryad waved her closer with a welcoming, motherly smile. The girl slowly descended the steps into the emerald waters and walked over. The warm liquid rose up along her legs all the way to her shoulders and drenched the new robe. She reached for the Dryad's stretched out hands. Karina embraced her in a tight hug. The ceremony will now begin. I will submerge your head. Take a deep breath and try to hold it for as long as you can, okay? The girl nodded and took a deep breath before she descended into the depths. It didn't feel like she had just entered a pool of water. She was suddenly surrounded by a deep emptiness. As if she was floating just above the ocean floor. Fortunately, it didn't stay empty, or she would have become scared. A familiar warmth approached her cautiously. A presence she knew from the Seven Saras. Something she touched upon every time she spoke one of the spells. She felt a deep connection with nature. She felt Karina's great tree and the meadows below it. Her mind reached further to the thick jungles outside and even further where, a dark entity was gnawing away at the light of life. A corruption. Coughing and gasping for air, she surfaced again. The darkness. I saw. PSH, it's okay. The darkness is locked up in a faraway place, don't worry. But she cried with tears streaming down her face. She had felt the pain of the plants that were swallowed and corrupted by whatever the darkness was. Their howls of pain in the darkness. Karina looked at the girl in surprise. It's okay. It is something far away and will never be able to hurt you. Stay calm now, she kept stroking her head in her embrace. Her other hand held her wrist as all the green pigment in the pool suddenly rushed towards Pip. Where Karina was holding her wrist appeared a green mark, like the tattoo of a vibrant flower. Every apprentice had a different tattoo which would grow as their connection with nature grew. With this, her ceremony was finished and Pip could continue to become a witch of nature. Go, Pip. Come back tomorrow for your first lesson. But what about tomorrow, my child? Okay, the girl said with a smile and left. Pip left the tree confused but was soon distracted by the feast they held to celebrate her inauguration. She didn't want to talk about what she saw and used a chance to distract herself. It wasn't every day that they could eat so much as during the celebrations for new apprentices. She decided to trust her master and wait until tomorrow. The next day in the morning she arrived to her private lessons with the Dryad. Every apprentice was personally guided by the Dryad as their connections to nature were all unique. What magic to learn and how to strengthen their bond all depended on the aptitude and goals of the apprentice. Karina had a small abode grown from roots and leaves at the foot of the tree where people could find her for lessons or to ask for advice. The girl bowed to her master when she entered the small hut. Hello, Pip. You are quite early for your first lesson, she greeted her apprentice. I was too excited for today. And also Pip didn't know how to continue. You were worried about what you saw. Yes. You should be. It is a terrible danger, but you do not need to worry. All apprentices have seen this horror, but there is nothing to be afraid of. Ever since I have awoken as the spirit of the tree, the corruption was locked by a strong divine power. The darkness can never touch you here. The young girl smiled relieved when she heard the Dryad assure her. So, have you already decided on the direction of your path, Pip? Karina asked. Yes. I would like to focus on growth and control, the girl said a little embarrassed. The Dryad looked at her a little confused. You never struck me as the type to seek battle or become a builder. Pip blushed a little as her reason was only partly that she wanted to be able to protect herself. It's the superpower of one of my favorite comic book characters, she admitted, fiddling with her fingers. What? The Dryad looked at her questioningly. Obviously, she didn't know what a comic book was. Arim, like a role model from a fairy tale, the young girl somehow tried to explain. Oh, I see. Well, let's see if you have the aptitude. Karina took a look at her mark. A bittersweet vine? You might be more suited for the path you chose than you thought, Pip. The Dryad smiled at the girls cheering. The days to come were filled with training. She would often sit for hours to meditate and deepen her bond to the plants around her. Through her mark, she was able to communicate with nature and she needed to learn the will and preferences. It was the first step of growth and control. As her own mark was the bittersweet vine, she started off with similar creepers and climbers. She needed to know the plant's needs and wishes to grow them. Once she could grow it, came how to control it. The practice was less forcing one's will onto another and more like coaxing a friend to do you a favor. It was very similar to the Seven Saras. Never were they to harm or force anything. Pip's talent that showed in the games also came through in this practice. She was soon able to grow and control vines and she happily kept training it while taking cool poses and calling out names. It was the first time she heard the system's voice and just a second later her face was bright red. Ding! Title, Wannabe Plant Mancer gained. You have amused the system with your performance. Plus 15% affinity with all plant life. She had made sure nobody was around to see her, but she was still being watched. She wanted to just die then and there out of embarrassment. It was only after she calmed down a little, that she realized how great the title actually was. If one ignored the actual title, She was in a great mood just before her world started crumbling again. The bell called everyone to assemble. When she ran back, a big crowd of everyone currently living in Karina's Grove was already waiting. Pip arrived just in time to hear the word that ended her happiness. "All of you have to leave as quickly as possible," the Dryad exclaimed. Chapter 317. Taking over the place. As expected, the adventurers found the gates under siege by the outer guards, some warriors, mages, and controlled workers. The present freed people had a hard time resisting the charge, but with the reinforcement of adventurers, they could start picking out the guards in the crowd. While archers and magicians pulled their attention with long-range attacks and flashy magic, the assassins and thieves among the adventurers left the stronghold and infiltrated the enemy forces unseen. The army of workers finally came to a halt when the last person with authority was offed by the assassins. With these guards, fell the last people truly loyal to the theocracy. The stronghold was now fully under their control. And with everyone finally having some time to relax and recover, began Seth's nightmare. They brought the workers and the servants to the courtyard where the blacksmith had to release hundreds of people from their slave collars. He met Evan again, the tamer boy from Delta. He was emaciated and had a few wounds here and there, but the light in his eyes shone bright and a big smile was on his face when he was finally freed from his slave collar. Like all of them, he thanked Seth a lot before he followed the others. The freed worker and adventurers made their camp in the stronghold and went to rest. "Humph! So you really did it. I listened to what people were saying." The old man was also among the workers that had survived until today and came to have their collar removed. He looked unwilling at first. Seth was not sure whether he just didn't want to admit that someone else managed to do what he couldn't, or he just couldn't believe the situation and thought it might be a trap. Only when the cut collar finally fell to the ground and disintegrated, Seth could see tiny tears in the corner of the decrepit man's sunken eyes. He held them back and left without a word. For hours he had to cut open the collars one by one and listen to a crowd of people thank him. It was almost noon when he finally finished all of them. But after the tedious work, there was a bright spot. Seth had not been the only one working hard. The freed servants had manned the kitchen and a scrumptious feast waited for everyone. They had plundered the storage rooms and had cooked for hours. Everyone who had suffered under the tyranny would be able to eat to their heart's desire for the first time in a long time. Once several of the big halls had been repurposed to big dining halls. Once he had sat down at the dinner table, he had no intention of standing up any time soon. Bit by bit he was joined by Dohu, Evan, Linri, and the young dwarf, Wedden Duskforged. Wedden had finally gotten his chance to introduce himself. Puffles, the Great, was served whole roasted animals and barrels of ale in the courtyard as he was too big to fit the hallways and didn't bother shrinking down. "I heard what happened from Marcel and the other. I wouldn't have thought that you would be the person to save us all," the Great Tiger praised him. "What are you even talking about? I left the annoying work to others. I mean, we won thanks to the effort of everyone," he hurriedly corrected himself. "Yeah, I did the hardest work. Don't forget my compensation." The sorceress snapped and went back to remaining silent. Seth waited for the other to speak up, but it seemed that Puffles, the Great, was too occupied by his meal to listen in on their conversation. Or maybe eating those angels was enough to satisfy the nightmare of the skies, as the people started calling him. Dohu chuckled at his answer and took a big swig of beer. The feast slowly turned into a drinking competition filled with merry laughter. It wasn't just their group, but the whole hall was filled with conversations and laughter. Some were drinking in celebration and others to forget. Many of the mixed army had died, especially rebels and freedmen, and were buried in the outer courtyard of the stronghold. Whether they celebrated their fallen comrades or victory or tried to forget the loss and suffering, everything was drowned under the relentless waves of alcohol. Evan had long joined a row of people under the table who couldn't keep up with the forerunners. Dohu and Seth were relentless and were two of the last ones standing, however shaky it was. Still, no matter how many people, human, beast people, demons or other races, none could keep up with Wedden. Although he was young, nobody could beat a dwarf in a drinking competition. Except for maybe another dwarf. When Dohu and Seth lacked the strength to even lift their tankard, Wedden was jugging down the beer like water and competed with another demi-human or something. Seth was far too drunk to process the situation. Linri, who had not joined their reckless drinking orgy, helped Seth stand up, and it was the last thing he remembered from that evening. Gamma. Lena, princess of the Krina Empire, was truly surprised by the support that had joined them recently. The man called Mark Baker had brought along a group of adventurers in smooth alien-looking armors painted with a big circle, like a zero, on their chest. With their strength and weaponry, they were comparable to A-rank adventurers. Another group of people he brought along were just called the technicians. Although Lena didn't understand the principle behind their classes, they were like magic scholars, like artificers, enchanters, or engineers. They brought interesting devices and apparatuses with them. They had similar items and devices from where she came from, but the structure was completely different. Two ways that reached a similar goal. The princess was quite compelled by this new technology, as nations like the Krana Empire normally kept their distance from technologically advanced worlds. They were seldomly open to their advances and rather xenophobic most of the time. Some of them were outright aggressive and would even try to invade through the portals they opened. That's why most multidimensional societies like the Empire kept their distance from these worlds. Earth was special in a sense because so many world-end scenarios had met on one planet. Realistically speaking, it was simply easier to talk to someone who had already fallen to his knees in despair. As such, few people among those in the Empire had knowledge of the fusion between magic and science. It was quite intriguing and saved Lena the effort to request similar devices from the Empire. After they got rid of the traitor, and together with the reinforcements from the Empire, she could finally shift a starter village to the outskirts of Gamma. From this point onwards, everything started progressing smoothly. They were able to intercept Zarkist scouts and suffered no losses during their own ambushes and skirmishes with the enemy. Their coalition of Arjit Noor, Krana, and Y City was on a constant rise until the enemy suddenly fell silent. Just when they were sure to have found their headquarters, the Great Temple of Zarkan, they couldn't find a single one of them. No scouts, no camps, no troops. Finally, they decided to send a shock troop to the location. They found the giant temple complex completely empty. Lena and the others were sure this was a trap and decided not to act prematurely. Nothing happened. It was as if the Zarkists had vanished from the face of the earth. The undead forces swept through Gamma and couldn't even find stragglers of the powerful enemy. East of Gamma, a tall man with a solemn expression rode on a great and lavish carriage, flanked by hordes of disfigured humanoids. He was surrounded by a huge ball made up of a great number of floating talismans which were all interconnected by strings of light. All the connections among these glowing talismans ultimately lead to the man, the champion of Zarkan. The big trap the coalition was expecting existed but had to be scrapped. The untimely retreat of the allied forces, the theocracy of chains, forced them to vacate their budding kingdom. One day, out of nowhere, the angels and beasts, the slaves and priests, came to a halt and left without so much as an explanation. This left him no choice but to flee and relocate the net of immortality, as he called it. Too many forces to the west had found a way to break their bond with Zarkan. All he could do was to flee into the unexplored east, deep into the no-man's land, and bide his time. As long as he devoted himself to Zarkan and grew his skills and level, he would come back and conquer the continent. Chapter 318. Dealing with Stuff. Seth woke up in a soft and warm bed. He had drunk a lot, but the hangover was manageable. He still remembered that Linri had helped him walk. Looking around, he found that she had brought him to one of the big rooms that previously belonged to the higher priests. Someone had gotten rid of the dead body and changed the bedding. It wasn't the blood-stained mess he had left. Sleeping beside him was the priestess in question. What happened? In shock, he lifted the blanket and found both of them fully clothed. His heart stopped rushing and he calmed down again. I thought you liked women. Aren't taking her? Stop right there, Puffles. I'm a taken man. Unless Mina agrees to let her join, I wouldn't touch another woman. I mean, the likelihood of Mina enjoying a third party joining is pretty high anyway. Wait. You hooked up with that dessert-stealing minx. I will not accept this. Are you still hung up about that? Also, that's not your decision. The great me will never forget a debt. I was saving the ice cream for last, and she just took it. She took it from me. Can't you understand my anguish? How can you betray me like this? I would expect it from the nympho, but not you. Puff, listen. No. Listen, I will. I'm not listening to you. I will buy you a wagon load of ice cream, okay? So much that you will get brain freeze and indigestion for days. Okay. Really? You will hate me for the amounts of ice cream I will force you to eat because it will be so much, we can't refrigerate it and you will have to eat it all in one sitting. Deal? Deal. Drama queen. Al interjected. Sex maniac. Please bicker among yourself and not in my head. Having a hangover is already bad enough, even without the voices in my head having an argument. "Oh, hey. Seth, you awake?" Linri announced that she was awake, too. "Good morning. How are you?" "Great." But a question kept me awake for a long time. He looked at her and waited for her to spit it out. "What is going to happen from now on? You will keep your promise, right? You said you would take me to Delta. Do you have a plan? You wouldn't go back on your word, right?" What a great question to ask early in the morning when I have a headache. Don't worry. If I wanted to break my promise, I would have broken the space lock and run off earlier. This question brought up one of Seth's biggest headaches and the reason he didn't deactivate the space lock. Many of the adventurers here were above level 40. Once the lock was gone, they could simply use home call and return to Delta. But those below 40, like Evan, and the foreigners like Whedon, or Linri, that were not part of the system were stuck here. From his map Seth knew they were somewhere east of Alpha, in the vicinity of Deltan. Roughly where Simon's starter village was located before. This meant they were half a supercontinent away from Delta. And those who couldn't use home call would need to travel the whole distance by foot. This could take months. There were 3 districts between their current location and Delta. There were Alpha, Cerebellum, and Epsilon. As far as Seth knew, the first 2 were completely covered in forest. Seth remembered how they talked about the Silver Road in history. It was a long trade route from northeast to center-south of the continent. People in ancient times would spend years traveling back and forth. Seth was not the only one who was thinking about the future and the way home. He was in the middle of explaining the dilemma to Linri when a messenger knocked on the door just at this moment. The chosen leaders of the different groups currently present in the stronghold were holding a meeting to decide on their next steps. As the hero, who had liberated them, he was invited to join them. It was probably his best chance not to deal with the journey alone. Seth washed up with life magic and set off to join the meeting in one of the bigger meeting rooms of the castle. On the big dark wooden table sat 6 people. Besides Marcel and Elsa, who presented the adventurers from Delta, there were the leaders of the freed people, the races, as well as the representative of the rebels and the chimeras. "It's great you decided to join." Marcel greeted him while everyone else just stared silently. Yet. "Hi," he said awkwardly and sat down. "Since everyone has arrived, shall we start?" The plan was for everyone to state the demands of their groups, but the representative of the rebels asked for the word. "I know all of you have your own ideas and suggestions for the future, but there is something everyone needs to know before we start this talk." He paused and looked into the round. Nobody interrupted him, so he continued. "This stronghold will be gone within a week." They all looked at the man in confusion. Everyone except Seth, who had an idea about what he was talking about. "We checked the different formations. Without the priests that kept supplying them with power, the circle that kept the jungle at bay has stopped functioning. From our estimates, it will take about a week for the wood to take over the stronghold." The attendees were shocked and stayed silent with a grave expression on their faces, and they tried to process the new information. Everyone except the adventurers had some plans to stay in the stronghold for a while. The rebels and former slaves had no way to return, and the chimeras had no place to return to. Only a few of them had fragmented memories of their past. Now everyone needed to think of a way to leave this place. "You don't seem surprised, hero." The chimera suddenly talked to him. She was mostly human but kind of stretched with 2 pairs of arms. From what Seth had seen, she was a power caster of some sort. Her completely green eyes with yellow patches gave her an alien feeling. "Yet, I have seen what those trees can do and how fast they grow. That it will even take a week is the surprising part." "How would you know?" the rebel suddenly interjected. Seth deliberated whether to tell them but ended up telling them. "I am originally from here. I was here during the first days of the apocalypse when the forest started growing. It took mere days to completely cover whole cityscapes." Now everyone was looking at him. What? For the next 30 minutes, he was forced to tell them everything he knew about the approximate situation of the southeastern corner of the continent. Most of what he knew about that, he knew from Simon. He told them about the hanging tree and his experience in the corrupted woods. Also, that the direct connection to Delta would most likely lead them through half a continent of terrifying woods. Nobody had to speak it out loud as their expressions were sufficient. They all came to the conclusion that forming one big, joint caravan would ultimately be the best decision to get everyone safely out of this hellhole. The conversation promptly changed to talks about their travel route. They all were clear on the fact that going through the woods was the worst possible decision. If everyone agrees, we can follow the route we came up with before. Although we didn't know that about the dangers of the forest, we plan to aim for Gamma. Marcel suggested. Among the group of adventurers behind Marcel and Elsa were not just those from Delta. Other Orihumas had been caught by the theocracy. These people told them of a free city in the no man's land to the north called Hope. The adventurers had planned to send a few back to Delta and inform the Krona Empire of their current situation. To their knowledge, the princess and her forces should be present in Gamma where they fought the Zarkists. The caravan could aim for Hope, stock up on supplies there, and then go in a straight line to Gamma where they hoped to meet the Empire's forces. According to the locals, there was no forest like this further in the north. Meaning this route could also mostly avoid the various dangers Seth had told them about, and they had a safe checkpoint. Seth was glad that others were pulling more than just their own weight. It meant he could just go along with the caravan and more or less relax. They could even send letters to Delta using returning adventurers as carrier pigeons. The result of the meeting was the Great Caravan Plan, and as a consequence, the stronghold became busy for the next few days. The whole structure was looted and anything useful was packed up for travel. Chapter 319. Through the Grapevines. Delta. What did you say? Monique put down her weapon. Team 1 of the field service had just returned from dealing with a high-level threat in Delta. Minasmar was busy even with the new Oath Guard finally joining the subjugations. The field generators and finally arrived not too long ago, but the authorities were still hard at work setting them up. For this they actually prioritized other regions first, leaving Minasmar to protect their part of the city for a while longer. Monique didn't complain as it all worked in their favor. At this point, they were the most favored guild in Delta. They almost couldn't restock as fast as people bought their products at the Turquoise Anvil. Even with the additional alchemists they recruited, they could barely supply enough. Seth had left behind an enormous amount of uncommon and rare items, but even those started dwindling recently. The whole city was gearing up and Minasmar was raking in profits. Wiping the sweat from her face and unequipping her armor, she took 2 letters from Evie's hands. A messenger from the System Church had brought them while she was away. One was from Simon and the other was from their lost blacksmith. Simon's letter held a summary of the situation and the general info on what was going on with the kidnapped people. It was one of the more fantastical stories she had heard since the world went bonkers. All survivors of the rebellion in the theocracy's stronghold were aiming for a place called Hope somewhere in the eastern no man's land. From there they intended to go straight to Gamma, evading the forested southeast, and meet up with Princess Lena. Seth's letter roughly stated the same things, but in less detail. It was more of, "I'm fine. Don't worry about me. I'm already on my way home. Make sure it still stands when I get back," kind of message. Additionally, to the summary, Simon also included Lena's plans. The Empire's princess had already built a fortification at Gamma where the refugees could stay and be safe. Because of the sudden disappearance of the Zarkists and the Empire's reinforcement, she was ready to make a bold move. She put together an expedition to travel toward the east and meet up with the stronghold's survivors. And then came the reason why Monique even got the letter. She couldn't help but chuckle a little, as the princess's intention was just too clear to her. Simon asked for reinforcement from Minasmar, namely Yulecat's fur. Of course, it was packed up as a favor, that the party could come and help their friend and Mina could help to save her boyfriend. As a reason, it was mentioned that Orihumas could not accurately travel through the pathwork gates of the System Church. This was true, but Monique saw through all the excuses and guessed the true intention. The princess didn't need the manpower. Lena wanted Finn. Of course, Monique was just joking about herself. She gave a heavy sigh. Being a tower master seemed so easy when Seth did it. It would become even busier when Mina and the others went to meet up with Seth. How did Seth deal with all the stress as the leader of such an organization? The longer it went on, the more she felt that she really wasn't fit for this position. She wanted Seth back, too. When Team 2, Yulecat's fur returned from their dungeon run, Monique immediately called them and informed them of the situation. If there wasn't a fixed date for their departure to join the princess, Mina and Finn would have already rushed out the door. Finn especially was euphoric on the chance to go and save Seth. He would finally realize how glorious and majestic she was when she saved his life like a silver knight on a white horse. And then he would spend a lot more time with her to play. Mina obviously wanted to go save her boyfriend. Also, she didn't get any action in the last weeks because said boyfriend had been kidnapped. The earlier they reunited, the earlier they could redacted. Seeing his sister like this, Mike couldn't help but agree. Although he always tried to deny that side of her, bad things could happen if she became desperate. Bulko didn't mind joining an expedition. If he was honest, he had slightly missed traveling around lately. The only one slightly reluctant was the half-elven mage Lixis. But she became eager when Mike shared another of his reasons for going. While everyone else was busy getting hyped for the journey, he had read the 2 letters. In passing, Seth had mentioned that he had finished their gear to level up his skills. This meant if they went to meet Seth, they would be able to get new toys, their new equipment sooner, and play around, test them out in the wild. The elf was immediately sold on going on this rescue mission. Would these guys really be able to bring back Seth quicker? Wouldn't they rather hinder his return? Monique could only shake her head. She could only hope they succeeded. A few days later, the date when they were scheduled to leave Delta and port to Gamma's Starta village, the party was approached by Evie. "Evie! Did you come to send Finn off?" the fairy greeted her. "Yes, I came to see you off. But I also wanted to give you something." The young woman brought out a golden plate the size of a manhole cover. It was covered in runic carving and occult inscriptions. "What is this?" Finn said with big eyes. "It's an experiment. I took some of the arcane gold from Seth's workshop to make it. I hope he won't be angry. Anyway, can you take it with you?" "Sure, but aren't you going to tell us what it is?" Mike, the party leader, finally spoke up. "It would be embarrassing if I told you and it ended up not working. It's an experimental thing after all. When you find Seth, give it to him. He will know what to do with it, and if everything works you are in for a surprise," she said mysteriously with a mischievous smile. In the end, Mike agreed to take the huge plate with them. "Gamma! My lady, they will be arriving soon," an officer informed the princess. "Okay, thank you for notifying me. I will be there shortly," Lena said with a serious expression. Only when the door closed, and she had made sure that nobody could see her, did her face twist into a grimace of glee and joy. "I knew it was a great idea to make this expedition. I finally get to meet Finn again. And we can travel together for several weeks. Finally. I wanted to cuddle her so badly for the last weeks." She jumped up, made a pirouette, and turned back to her all serious self before leaving the room. She didn't care about the Zarkists that fled or Seth. She was only looking forward to spending time with the fairy. Chapter 320. Hello Forest my old. On the morning of the 3rd day after conquering the stronghold, a caravan of almost 2,000 people was ready to set off into the unknown. Despite initial estimations, the forest had already taken grasp of the outer courtyard and was creeping on the walls of the castle. The mighty walls built by slave hands were already crumbling under nature's advance. The previously deforested area outside the stronghold was already filled with lush big trees. On the wide outer courtyard, a large fleet of carts was assembled, and they had to put up guard to periodically cut down any plant that came through the walls. The servants and workers had used building materials to make these carts and carriages. Most were tied to pets and summons because there were not nearly enough draft animals to pull them all. People like Evan were a great help in this situation, as they had numerous tamed beasts, and some had even managed to tame the animalistic chimeras to pull their carts. While in normal caravans the vehicles would carry the goods and rations, these were filled with the servants and workers who could not keep up with the walking speed of the Orihuma. Overall, the carts would increase the speed of the caravan. Rations and supplies were distributed to porters with an item box who would be in charge of building the campsites and the meals. Seth sat on Puffle's back, who was perching atop one of the towers of the castle. Behind him were Linri, Whedon, and Dohu. He had made a saddle for all of them to strap in and ride the centipede. All the people he cared about were with him. Evan would be among them, but he was needed with the caravan. "It's a shame we can't just fly home like this." Seth sighed. "I am great and powerful, but I told you already, that I can't fly for a long time at once." Yeah, I know. It's still creepy to have someone talking in your head," Linri commented, as the Evisor talked to everyone. "I prefer knowing that the giant beast I am sitting on is a sentient being that can be communicated with. Also, that it prefers ale and cookies over dwarven flesh. Have you ever tried raw meat? Let me tell you, you all taste disgusting. No one in their right mind would eat that if they didn't have to." "I feel offended but reassured," Whedon answered jokingly. Soon the caravan got into movement. A group of adventurers made up of mages and warriors formed the head of the caravan. With magic and skills, they would cut a path through the thick vegetation. The demons would have been a great help in this group, but many of them had gone through changes. As the desires they uttered during the pact were fulfilled, most of them lost their powers to varying degrees. Everyone with the map skill had gotten a roughly drawn map with the presumed location of Hope so the caravan could stay on track. People with flying mounts would go fly ahead and scout the landscape. Seth would have joined them, but all leaders had unanimously agreed that he and Puffles should stay behind the caravan to help in case they were attacked by something the guards couldn't handle. The guard was made up of adventurers, freed warriors, and chimeras who surrounded the carts on all sides. They were armed with weapons and armor from the castle's armory. Seth and Whedon had spent the last 3 days making armors and weapons to make up the numbers. Even the non-combatants were armed with crudely made axes and hatchets, tools, and even clubs fashioned from wood, just in case they needed to fight. The caravan set into motion with the spearhead flattening the shrubbery and the occasional tree. Like a giant snake, the row of carts unraveled and followed the spearhead into the thicket. They came past the area where the workers were previously stationed and there was almost nothing left of the worker camp. Even the magnificent stone road they were building was broken apart by nature with only a few big stones visible between the trees. When the end of the caravan finally left the gates of the outer courtyard, Puffles floated down and followed at the very end. As creepy as the many legs looked, they made for a very smooth riding experience. The passengers and their mount could leisurely talk or even sleep during the travel. "I'm really glad to have you, Puff. Yeah, you finally see my greatness? The greatest troop transporter there is." "Don't be mean, Al. What is a troop transporter?" "Don't worry about it, Puff." The Eyevisor's head suddenly turned to the west. "Did you detect something?" "Wait, don't tell me you also have overpowered detection skills." "No. Just a weird feeling." "The west?" Seth decided to keep an eye on that direction but didn't dwell on it any further. The caravan's speed picked up a little once they got some distance between themselves and the Theocracy's former base. Here the forest was made up of big, unidentifiable trees. There was a lot of space thanks to their wide crowns and a lot less shrubbery in between them. It brought up uncomfortable memories for Seth as he remembered his escape from Alpha. Thinking back, a cold shiver ran down his back when he thought about the hanging tree. That thing had been barely a day old and covered a whole city. With over a year's time, just how much bigger and more terrifying would it have become? And then those terrible griffins. He would never forget that terrible cry like an eagle or a falcon. It was as if he could vividly hear it. Yeah, just like that. He could really hear it. Seth looked to the treetops, just like Puffles and many others among the caravan members. Look and behold, it really was one of those disgusting creatures. The muscles under its taut, leathery, black skin glinted in the light that fell through the leaves. Its razor-sharp beak just closed, and its sharp eyes were fixated on the caravan. The batwings were stayed folded while it held onto the tree with its terrifying claws. Why didn't it move from there? Did it just cry to get their attention, or? It called reinforcements. Get in formation. Others in the caravan had the same idea as him and already started to rally the guard. This was a really bad time for this. Since the forest had a lot more space here, the caravan had spread out to move faster. Before they knew it, the carts and wagons were spread in irregular intervals between the trees. Had they stayed in a single file or the agreed-upon formation, they could have covered the caravan in overlapping shields. Now they had a hard time gathering and cooperating. Long before the people on the ground managed to rally, a bunch more beasts appeared in the trees around them. Their cries filled the forest with a headache-inducing cacophony. It was literally a sonic attack, and many of the previous servants fainted on the carts while weaker combatants and guards got terrible headaches. Linry and Whedon behind Seth had almost immediately lost consciousness. The adventurers didn't just watch, but only a few mages managed to cast spells while enduring the attacks. Among the attacks shot off from the caravan, only 5 hit their targets. One was a storm of light bolts that perforated the biggest and loudest beast together with the tree it stood on. Another consisted of 2 pale blue fire lances that impaled the very first griffin and burned it to ashes within a moment. These 2 were obviously those of Puffles and Seth. 3 more of them were felled by a wave of ice needles, a bundle of lightning strikes, and a perfect headshot right through the eye respectively. Seth had not expected it, but it seemed like there was an extremely talented archer among the people of the caravan. With half of the creatures dead, the attack weakened, and more people found the strength to attack and aim. However, it was too late as more and more had been summoned by the cacophony. The attack had simply been a means to stop them from escaping. More and more of the newcomers simply rushed to attack the caravan, aiming to snatch the unconscious people. It was time for the guards to shine as they entangled the beasts in melee combat. The battle looked more than just chaotic, The corrupted griffins, as Seth liked to call them in his mind, with their bird heads, muscular lion-like bodies, batwings and snake tails were one thing. But they fought not just humans and all kinds of different humanoid races. On their side were chimeras with several arms or legs, not necessarily human ones. Some even had a monster head, or several. They were covered in various types of skin, scale, and patches of fur, sometimes all on the same body. As varied as their appearances, were also their skills. Different kinds of breaths, cursed gazes, poison bites, or claws. The most normal ones were still those using weapons or mages like their leader Seth had met before. Her powerful lightning magic shot from her forearms kept causing tremendous damage wherever it hit. While the recovered mages and archers concentrated on getting rid of the screaming griffins, the vanguard kept defending the caravan from the attacking ones. After 30 minutes the beasts decided that this prey was not worth the effort and retreated. They left behind 23 rapidly decaying bodies and a slightly exhausted caravan.